And gents, just as you've noticed, obviously the event is for free. All the content on the web is for free. So obviously we've got companies supporting us, sponsoring us, and our champion today is ETC, Electronic Toll Collection. Kuni and his team, thank you very much for sponsoring us and hosting us, Kuni. We really appreciate that. And Kuni will do the official welcome just now. We've got also other companies. We've got Oricon, consulting engineers. I don't know if there's somebody from Oricon who want to come and say a few words quickly. Nobody from Oricon? No. I know they're here, it's just too shy to come to the front. Then we've got VIX Technology, Chart. I know you're somewhere in the audience. Want to say a few words? Not? Okay. We've got C-Track. Anybody from C-Track? Yeah, let's go back to VIX Technology, ladies and gents. VIX Technology is automatic fare collection, monitoring your operations, especially focused also on vehicles in a city, public transport and so on, making sure that you know what's going on. Besides automatic fare collection, all about also making sure that the money gets where it's supposed to go. In other words, clearinghouse and that stuff, switching and so on, that's assisting that in a great extent, and that's quite a big need in our systems today. C-Track is making your assets visible, fleet management, tracking of your assets. We've got Railways Africa magazine. It's all about rail infrastructure. You should subscribe there, ladies and gents. A very powerful magazine, really great to know what's going on. Philippa and her team is doing good work there. We've got the Transnet Center of Systems Engineering, all about design thinking, developing systems and so on, very much involved also obviously for Transnet. We've got Brand Source, Jody Haig, all about communication. She's now for a year a gold sponsor with us. And then we've got Kulula Work. You can see there's the banner as well, and on your tables you should find some pamphlets about Kulula Work. It's making corporate travel much more convenient, much more affordable, much more easier. So on the Transport Forum's website, you should be able to find all the links to these sponsoring companies. So I think let's give them a proper hand. Then, last but not least, we've got Paul Oppel from Event Streaming. He's the guy doing the streaming for us. Ladies and gentlemen, very affordable pricing. Professional work, directors they use are also doing, for example, the Miss SA pageant and stuff like that. So it's very professional work they're doing. Paul, thank you very much supporting us and doing the streaming for us. Right, the restrooms, if you exit the registration desk, you go to the reception in the building, just on the opposite side of the wall, you'll see there's the restrooms. Also, ladies and gents, you'll see at the end of this program, there's a lucky. Let me just get it. So here's the lucky draw item. It's a stainless steel housing glass jug, and it's a power drive blender. So it's a very nice lucky draw. So at the end of the event, you might be the lucky winner of this very nice lucky draw. Then, ladies and gents, beside being able to look at this streaming again afterwards on the Transport Forum's YouTube channel, you'll also be able to download all the presentations. It should be uploaded to the website by noon tomorrow, everything, all the pictures taken here, the presentations on, you should be able to download them for free. Obviously, we force you to log in, and you should use your login screen. Before you, in other words, if you click on downloads on our website, you shouldn't be able to see, or you will not be able to see the downloads. So you need to log in first. And the reason being is so that I can obtain your contact details, so that I can send you my weekly beautiful emails. Thank you for having me in your inbox. That's the deal. And then once you've logged in, you go to downloads. And once you're in downloads, you have a little search engine. You can click on category. It will give you a pull-down menu. You can scroll down to today's date, and it will open up all the presentations presented here today, and you can download them. As simple as that. you actually should be able to see all the presentations presented at this forum over the past 12 years. So that's great content, all for you. And the website, you can see there, we've got, actually we say there's 7,000 unique visitors, actually much more, more than 8,000 unique visitors per month. This website's actually got more than 1 million hits per month. So it's quite busy. It's simple, but it's obviously very functional. So thank you also for using this website and sharing information with us. All right, so ladies and gents, I want to hand you over to our host for the day. And obviously our program director is Mike Schussler. Mike, thank you very much for your good work. I conveniently also going to hand you over to Mike soon to do the program directing further. But first I would like to have Connie from Mark, CEO of Electronic Toll Collection, to come and do the official welcome. Thank you very much, Connie.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? Better? Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. From my side, more. Better? Oh yes, good morning. Right, we're all awake, thank you. From my side, thank you very much for participating in today's conversation. Last year, ETC started the conversation about what are we doing around e-tolls. We've seen the public outcry, we've seen how the public behave, and we felt that we need to initiate a conversation, a public conversation. What gives this credibility is the fact that we've got forums like the Transport Forum that allows us to, at a professional level, engage and argue the pros and cons, alternative solutions to e-tolling and the like in a productive, constructive way. So we at ETC believe that we have to have clear, transparent, open communication. And from my side, I would really like to thank you for being here this morning and this afternoon, and also contributing. So I really encourage you to ask even provocative questions. I think we do need to get the debate going, and I'm really energized to see that from the first event that we had last year to now, we've already seen a significant growth and participation, and obviously there's a lot of interest. I think just a small comment from my side, and that is that we need people in South Africa to start finding solutions to our problems. We cannot continue to just discredit what we have built and what we have in our environment. We cannot continue as citizens in South Africa just blaming government or blaming somebody for poor decisions and bad decisions. And that's what is at heart of our sponsorship. I am looking for leaders. I am looking for people that want to constructively change the future of South Africa. And so I really ask you to engage. I really ask you to ask the provocative questions. And I hope that this afternoon and this morning will be really rewarding to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connie. Really appreciate your sponsorship, continued sponsorship, and we're looking forward to spending the day with you. Now over to our program director, Mike Schussler. Thank you, Mike. You've done an excellent job for us last time, so we're looking forward to working with you this time again. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry. We're going to start, and we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, which is a great thing. I'd rather keep the presentations within, say, 2 or 3 minutes of their length, and rather have a little bit more time for the panel discussion at the end, I think. That's first of all. And second of all, when we're talking about roads and the economy, just my introductory remarks. You know, in the news today, I think we're all overwhelmed with the load shedding. Last time we spoke about road shedding, you know, with the blockage of roads and the like. I think if one looks at the economy and one compares it to the human body, then I really think like roads and electricity and water are the arteries. Perhaps sewage is the colon. But ultimately, you know, the body needs those nutrients and it needs that transport. It really does. And we can debate, the Economist had a debate many years ago, and they recently resurrected it with electricity. 20 years ago it was, do roads bring development or does development bring roads? You know, is it a chicken or an egg situation? Last week they did electricity in Africa, where they say there's a bit of a dispute whether electricity brings development. And, you know, I think they need to come to South Africa, because I think you can see what happens when you don't have electricity. If those arteries in the economy are not flowing, then the economy cannot work and function. And yes, we can compare all sorts of things. The leadership is perhaps the thinking part of our brains. The memory is the information that we get in the economy today, etc. So you can compare the economy to a human body. And the point that I'd like to make is that roads are very much central to this, because without an artery, the brain doesn't have food. All right? It's as simple as that. And the roads are a critical part of an economy, and the transport is also obviously, it's more than roads, it's obviously harbors and it's rail and everything like that. And that's my introduction. I think we've just got to keep it in a sense of where we are. And I think we can have a bit of a debate maybe later. Do you get development first or do you get roads first? So the presenters that are here can think about that. And the first person I call up is Lo Kahnemeyer. He's going to look at the future of national roads, 2030 roads plan, and a sustainable funding model. And we all know sustainable funding is a very much part of the picture today, because we've seen what happens when you don't have the money at Eskom. You can be really in a rip-roaring problem, and that can damage an economy quite severely. Lo, thank you. Give him a good hand.
Thanks, Program Director. Is it working? Can everybody hear me? Thanks. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you here. Some of you are old faces. I see you on many occasions. Some of you not necessarily. I think today, my presentation here today, there's quite a number of slides. So I'll be going relatively quickly through them, and hopefully I will be able even to answer some of the economist questions that has been posed to ourselves. I think if one look at Africa and you look at the work done by the World Bank, you'll see that there are 5 transport challenges that are facing Africa. One is the high rate of fatalities. I think we can clearly in South Africa link with that. The second is the increasingly congested cities with poor urban planning. At the moment, Africa's got the highest rate of urbanization in the world. If you look at the predictions, they say by 2050, 60% of all Africans will live in cities. If you look at where we are in South Africa, we're already at 65.8%. The predictions are that by 2050, it will be nearly 75% of all people in South Africa will be living in cities. And you need to ask yourselves, why do everyone want to move to the city? Why? Why do they want to go there? Is it because of poor service delivery in the small towns, where there's no job opportunities because of poor service delivery? Poor connectivity hampering regional trade. It's a classic example here in SADC in terms of between countries, how poor road networks makes it impossible for countries to economically active participate in trade. And you rather import something than just getting it from your neighbor across. Weak capacity and poor governance. I think we don't need to say much in that one. And then climate change. I think in terms of climate change, what a lot of people not is aware of in terms of what's happening going forward, large parts of South Africa, as you can see the grey there, is virtually becoming not suitable for any form of grain farming or anything like that. So the reality of that is it's going to force a lot of people to migrate to the eastern parts of South Africa. That will still be slightly habitable and things like that. So if one look at where's the rest of the world compared to these issues, the rest of the world, most of them have compact cities, high density corridors, short distance, very good public transport system. They've got integrated transport systems in place where the people are able to utilize those. Climate change resilience, they are far advanced in terms of looking at the impacts of climate change and how it's going to impact their infrastructure. And obviously the whole issue of smart roads. It's a major topic there in terms of the integration between technology and transport. Where are we in terms of our road network? If you look at South Africa, we've got the 10th longest road network in the world. So we've got about 750,000 kilometers. The total network in the country is about 1.3 million if you include all the private roads and things. But if you look at gazetted roads, it's about 750,000, the 10th longest. Very important when you look at this number, because a lot of people will bring up the thing, why is fuel cheaper in Botswana and Lesotho, and they're getting it from South Africa? Look at the difference of the network at the bottom they have to sustain in their countries. We've got 750,000. Look at where they're sitting here at the bottom. Lesotho 7,400 kilometers, Swaziland 3,500, Botswana 25,000. They have a much smaller network in their country that they need to sustain and maintain. If one look at the importance of the roads in South Africa, if you look at freight movement and total passenger movements, you'll see that in South Africa at the moment, 87.9% of all freight in this country, all freight, moves on roads. This includes the core Sishen Saldanha lines, all of those that you always hear about from Transnet. 87.9% of all freight move on roads. 93.7% of all person trips makes use of a road, of which obviously the minibus taxis, they are responsible for 41.6% of all people that are moved in the country, and they are not subsidized. So every time you'll talk about increasing the fuel levy, you'll hear the taxi industry saying, but we're not subsidized. Yet we are carrying the most people in the country. In terms of that, the bottom line is South Africa's economy in terms of mobility and access is dependent on our road network that we have in this country. If you look at congestion, as you've seen on the previous slide, the major modal choice of the users in the country is travel time. People are incredibly sensitive with regard to travel time, especially in the morning peak. So if you look at congestion, which is obviously the opposite of going somewhere fast, and you look at the impact, this is the TOMTOM index. So if you look at the TOMTOM index, this is the latest available, the new one is not yet published, you'll see Cape Town is ranked the highest or most congested in South Africa. It grew by about 5% from the previous report. Johannesburg sits second, but it's 70th in the world. It also saw an increase of about 3%. Then you've got East London, Pretoria. What a lot of people don't notice, if you look at this little thing there at the back on their website and you click there, you'll see this, that Johannesburg, or the whole area here, is one of the few TOMTOM award winners in the world in terms of the impact the GFIP and the Gautrain had on reducing congestion since it's been implemented. But a lot of people don't care to read and see the positives these kind of investments had. Here is something not published by Sunwell, so it's nothing, but you can clearly go and look at the trends. You can see where Johannesburg and Pretoria were before we started the improvements, how they were able to decrease over time because of those improvements that were done to the infrastructure. Look what happened to Cape Town. Cape Town were below Johannesburg, Pretoria, but look how Cape Town has surpassed Johannesburg and Pretoria in recent times. Clearly showing the benefit of the investments that were made in the infrastructure. Very important when you look at total transportation cost. 90% of your total life cycle cost of a road is road user related costs. So we as an agency, our cost to build, maintain and operate a road, if you look at total life cycle cost, only accounts for about 10%. 90% of the life cycle cost is the cost of the people making use of that road, and that relates to things like fuel, oil, tires, maintenance, depreciation of your vehicles, time, accidents, all accounting for that. Now, if you have a road in a good condition in South Africa, well maintained, in 1 hour, you typically will travel 100-kilometer far. If you have a road that's not properly maintained or heavily congested, in 1 hour, you'll be fortunate if you've traveled 20 to 25 kilometers in distance. That is the impact of poor road maintenance or congestion on your infrastructure. And that you can directly, the economists will be able to do their calculations and link it back to an economic impact that you will experience in your country. In South Africa, the distance it takes, the time it takes a truck from Cape Town to Beitbridge is just, it's about 2 days. Travel time, some of them do it in 18 hours. To travel that same distance from Beitbridge into the rest of Africa takes 2 weeks. And that just shows you the impact of infrastructure in its condition. Here you can see the logistics costs from the University of Stellenbosch, the latest available 2016 that they've published. In terms of your total logistic cost, you can see here they indicate 55% of that total cost, 277 billion they estimated in 2016, related to the cost of transport in your logistics chain. So once again, clearly indicating that the road user component is the biggest component of your transport logistic chain. If you look at the breakdown of that transport cost that you see there, you'll see the bulk of that cost goes into fuel. So you can see it has a major impact in terms of the cost of logistics. Fuel, then you see drivers' wages, maintenance and repair, depreciation, capital costs, insurance, tires, and then obviously the favorite of some, which apparently is driving all the costs, toll fees, sits over there, and then you can see licenses sits over there in terms of that. So it clearly indicates to you what are the major cost components of transport and how sometimes the numbers that are being quoted, you can see, are totally not in line with what reality is. The question that we were posed by Mike, the chicken or egg. So hopefully these photographic evidence, and please note it's from Google, not Sunroll. This is how Allendale Interchange looked in 2007 before we start the improvements. This is how it looks today. This is what access and mobility do. It allows private sector to move in and develop. This is how Menlyn Node looked in 2007 in Pretoria. Before we started the developments, if you look here, you'll see that's Garsfontein. It had no ramps. If you look at Atterbury there, you'll see how the layout looked. We did the improvements. Look at how it looks today. Look at this whole Menlyn main precinct of 6 or 8 billion the private sector has invested. Why? Because they've got access and they've got mobility. It's all about access and mobility that people are looking for. And we can show countless examples of where the infrastructure is put in place, private sector follow with development. Look at the R21, look at that. This is NatMap. So this is the National Strategic Plan from the Department of Transport in terms of what needs to be in place by 2050, in terms of our key corridors, road and rail. You can see they've done a thorough analysis of all economic nodes, economic activity, and they came up with various indications of where roads need to be improved. You can see with that whole migration of people due to climate change to the eastern parts of the country, major investments are identified in this area of the country for the long term in terms of that. So you'll see if you look at the NatMap, they've identified numerous corridors. If one now look at, say, for example, some of the key projects of Sunroll, you'll see a lot of our key projects are linking to those corridors. Now, these key projects that I'm showing you here were projects that we were able to identify, that we were able to do with what we call the evil word, toll financing, in terms of that, where through private sector we will be able to finance D roads and they will be able to sustain themselves. So these are the roads that are just shown over there. So they total 154 billion rand. In total, the estimated cost to doing these improvements. These are mostly all capex related improvements in terms of road capacity. So it is where we need to dual the road to a freeway standard. We need to add additional lanes because of the volumes of vehicles that are moving on these corridors, so that we can reduce congestion on these corridors. If one look at these, you can read I'm not going to read for most of this. You can see here, you'll see everywhere it says we're busy with detailed design, but we cannot proceed until the funding is resolved. We're busy with detailed design, but we cannot proceed until the funding is resolved to construct this, in terms of that. So as you can see, if we cannot fund these through a toll financing mechanism, and there is no money coming from central government through Treasury, then we cannot implement them. So if one look at the rest of the network in terms of pavement age, you'll see that 76% of the network that we manage is already older than its design life. And you can see here, if you look at the lengths, less than 5 years, there's about 2,200 kilometers, 5 to 10 years, 12,000 kilometers. The implication of this is we need to do major capital investment to go back and strengthen these roads for another cycle of 20 to 25 years. So once again, it's major investment that's required. You cannot prolong the life of these roads any longer just with basic preventative maintenance. You do need to have major capital injection. So once again, there's major funding required all over the network. Just to maybe also explain to people, because we sometimes do get clever people doing calculations and then publishing it for all to read. When you look at the road surface between an urban street, a provincial road, a national road, it looks the same. If it's surface, it's black mostly, and it's flat. If you measure the square meters per kilometer-ish, you get the same answer. But then the people start comparing how much does it cost. And then they say there must be something very funny, because if you look at an urban street, it costs 4 to 8 million per kilometer. If you look at a farm-to-market provincial kind of road, 8 to 20 million per kilometer. And if you look at a national road from Sunroll, look, 20 to 140 million. And then you'll hear the Guptas must be involved then. Now, people, please understand that the third dimension of a road is below the surface. You can't see it. And that's where all the engineering and cost is going in. A typical national road like this has got about 1.2 meters of layer work underneath the surface if it's like an N3 based on, it's all determined on the heavy vehicles it needs to carry. So at the surface, this local urban street of yours looks the same as that, but it's what's below the surface that makes the big difference. And what's very important to understand is that if you look at South Africa's pavement design, we use very thin surfacings, about 40, 45 millimeters to waterproof, because we don't have crude oil. And the product we use, bitumen here, is what remains from crude oil. So overseas, they've got lots of bitumen, so they use roads to get rid of that product. Lots of cars, a small country, lots of bitumen that they have to use. So they've got 100 to 400 millimeters thick layers at the surface. We've got 10 to 40. The time it takes for a crack to go from there to there is much longer than the time it takes for a crack. And if you have rain like what we have today and tomorrow, you'll suddenly see all the cracks, potholes appearing in the roads everywhere. Why? Because we use natural gravels here. When the water gets through the surface, this natural gravel gets wet, it loses its ability to carry load. That is what's happening when it rains for 2 or 3 days. And what happens then is, when it rains like that, potholes everywhere, and then everyone wonders, where is this now coming from? That's why it's so crucial in South Africa to keep your surface waterproof at all times. Virtually every 8 to 12 years, you need to apply something at the surface to keep it waterproof. That's unfortunately what's not been happening. So if you look at Sunroll, where do our money come from? We only have 2 sources of funding. We've got the non-toll network, which is 87% of our network gets a grant through Vote 35 of the Department of Transport, so that's an allocation coming from National Treasury. So National Treasury makes an allocation through Vote 35 of the Department of Transport. Then we have 13% of the network, which is the toll network, that we raise funding through bonds and loans on the capital markets, and then by collecting the toll, we repay those bonds with interest, as well as the cost of operations, future maintenance and expansions on that toll network. Those are the only two sources SANRAL currently have of income to be able to build all these roads that you see that are required there. We're one company with two different businesses, so our financials is evaluated as a combination of the toll and the non-toll. And that's where your going concern comes from. If the one business is not viable, because it's a single company, the way it's evaluated, the whole company, like you hear now, Eskom by April will not be a going concern. They will be technically insolvent. This is the budget trend of allocation of budget over time per kilometer of national road. What this shows you is that if you look at when all the major roads in this country were constructed in the late 70s, mid-70s, 80s, look at how much money was allocated by government per kilometer of road. That is what enabled all that new infrastructure to be built. Look where we're sitting now in terms of the allocations per kilometer. These allocations coming from Treasury does not enable us to go and build all these roads. We need to first maintain what we have before we can go and invest in all those major capex expansions that are required in terms of congestion. And that is the challenge we have. There is just not sufficient funding coming from National Treasury to do all these major projects. If you look at our financial statements, as I said, that's the toll side of the business. You'll see there we've got all these bonds that we've sold with certain maturity dates. What it means is come that date, you need to have a mechanism in place to repay that bond or roll it by selling new bonds. The problem you have is because of state capture, you've heard a lot of stories about all these places, and I please ask you, go and see anywhere at any commission where anything has popped up about SANRAL. Whether it's Bosasa, the Guptas, whoever, please bring me that article to show me the state capture at SANRAL. No. But because we're SANRAL and we're seen as a state-owned entity, we're seen as the rest. They say, oh, they're just clever, those people at SANRAL, they just have not been caught out. No, that's the response those people will give you. But if you look at, because of private sector refusing to buy state-owned entity bonds, we can no longer sell bonds. Because I cannot sell bonds, I cannot raise the capital to do work on the toll portfolio. And what is the impact of that? The impact of that is, if you look at our budget, where we were projected to be in this financial year, there's a gap of 14 billion rand. So Treasury reduced the non-toll allocation, and all of that. The net result that you see is we're sitting there instead of should have been there. So the impact of all of this is that there is no money to be able to roll out these projects. So that's why you hear in the press the construction industry is in dire straits. They are laying off people. You hear about people going insolvent and all of that. So if you look at just translating it for you back to all those key projects that we have of 154 billion. Those key projects, if we implement them, have the ability to employ 405,000 people based on our average number of people we employ per 100 million on our projects. It can create, in terms of full-time equivalents, 176,000 employment opportunities. The resistance against toll has stopped SANRAL's ability to borrow money to implement projects, which results in us not being able to roll out these job opportunities. That's how these things all link one to the other. Without money, we cannot do anything. If we've been able to implement these projects, imagine the spin-offs coming from investment by the private sector afterwards in terms of developments. All of that at the moment is not happening. And if you look at what's happening in the construction industry, you will see the impact this is having. If one look at road budget requirements, this is a study that was done in 2013 by the Committee of Transport Officials. The bottom line is we need about 89 billion rand in those terms to sustain and do all the improvements that's required on the network per annum. In today's rand terms, you're talking about 116 billion rand. To sustain the network we have, do all the improvements, the surfacings and all of that required, you need about 116 billion. The allocations, you'll see, is sitting at roughly about 44% or 50% of the need. The rest there is just no money for at this stage from National Treasury. So you need to say, what can we afford and how should we prioritize the available budgets that are coming through the system? If you look at the budgets, there are some changes coming through now again from Treasury. But if you look at fuel levy and if you look at license fees, you'll see that there's about 80 billion rand that is generated through that mechanism. And then if you look at what Treasury allocates back through various grants and all of that, you'll see that they allocate virtually, if you look at the numbers, this now excludes what the municipalities invest from their rates and taxes in roads. If you just look at direct allocations, you're sitting with about 72 billion, 75 billion. If you look at here at the bottom, there's not a huge gap from any one year to the next year in terms of what's currently collected by National Treasury and what's given back to the road sector. So there is no spare cash. A lot of people are saying they collect 10 and they give back 1. This is the DORA. It's on the internet. You can go and download it and confirm these numbers for yourself. There is no huge pockets of money lying around at Treasury that can be rechanneled to road investment. So when we go there to look for money, we compete with the Department of Health, we compete with the Department of Education, and they all just throw their hands in the air every time and say to Treasury, we'll close that hospital. I'll have to close 3 schools. Can you choose which 3 schools I must close? I mean, we from the road sector, I mean, when we throw our hands up and say, okay, I'm going to close the N1. And then Treasury is like, okay, there's lots of other roads. And that's the problem when you have an asset that's a network. We cannot blackmail Treasury because there's just another road that the person will then be able to take. If you look at fuel price, currently you'll see our fuel price is the 19th most or lowest or price. The cheapest obviously in Venezuela, it costs 1 cent a liter. But look at the economy. The most expensive at the moment is our neighbors, Zim, with 45 or 46 rand a liter. In terms of that, we're sitting at 19th in terms of cost. It's very important. A lot of people will look at this. They will look at this and say there's a lot of room to increase the fuel price in the country. But when you start looking at the affordability and the income spent, out of the 61 countries, although our fuel price is only the 19th most expensive, you'll see in terms of affordability, we were 56. And in terms of income spent per year, we were 60th. Which tells you that for the average South African, the fuel price as it is very expensive. And a large part of your income, daily wages or total salary, is spent on fuel. If you look at a country like Hong Kong, which is very expensive, you'll see because their people earn high salaries, because they've got a very small island to which nobody buys fuel, everybody makes use of public transport, the impact is not that huge to the average person in the street. So if one look at future funding for roads, I think what you've seen here, it's insufficient. The current sources of funding we have is either the fiscus, the fuel levy, license fees, or we've got tolls, or we had tolls in the past. These days, not that possible any longer. So there's resistance to tolls. So the question is, what other funding option is there? So if you look at, once again, technology, and just to explain to people, if you drive an oldish car, you use about 11 liters per 100 kilometers that you travel. Slightly a new car, 6 liters. If you start moving to hybrids, 2 liters per 100 kilometer that you travel. Obviously, if you're a full electric vehicle, you use no fuel. Out of every liter of fuel, there is a levy on it, currently 3.77 per liter. So if you use 11 liters per 100 kilometers, you are paying 37 rands in fuel tax to Treasury. They have an income of 37 rand. If you have a new car, a smaller car, you only pay 20 rand to Treasury. If you drive a hybrid car, you only pay 6 rand to Treasury for the same distance that you've traveled. And if you drive an electric car, you only pay 0 rand to Treasury. Yet I need to build that same road and maintain it for you. And this is where the issue comes in, where we say that despite vehicles occupying the same road space, the older vehicles, which are mostly owned by the poor or the very rich if it's a collectible, those vehicles are cross-subsidizing the ones that are able to afford newer, more fuel-efficient vehicles in terms of the process. And that this is confirmed. If you look at this graph over here, the green line, total number of vehicles registered on e-Natas in South Africa, there's currently about 11.5 million. It's grown over time. With over 10 years, our vehicle population has grown with 35%. At the same time, our fuel sales, petrol, which accounts for 77% of all vehicles in South Africa, 77.5% of all vehicles are petrol driven. Petrol sales over the same time has dropped by 3.3%. That is the impact of that vehicle technology that you're seeing there. We've got 35% more cars on our road, but we've sold 3% less fuel. That's the conundrum Treasury has with the fuel levy, where the income keeps on shrinking in terms of that. And going forward, it will even just be more if you look at the whole issue of the rise of electric cars and the impact that is going to have in terms of the overall income you can generate from the fuel levy. So the questions one needs to answer: what road network can we sustain in South Africa and at what condition level? How do we balance mobility versus access versus developmental needs? I'm finished, so. Land use management. A very big problem we have in South Africa is that, to give you an example, here in the Gauteng, the number of people that lives in a diameter circle of 80 kilometers, the same amount of people in London lives in 40 kilometers. So you now need to provide infrastructure and services over a 80-kilometer diameter circle to reach the same amount of people that you can reach in London with about 40-kilometer diameter circle. That explains to you why our public transport systems in South Africa is so inefficient and so difficult to sustain, because you do not have the density and the numbers in terms of people that can walk to a train station, take the train, climb off and walk to work. We're just not that, and unfortunately, the practice we have in South Africa is everyone wants a stand with a piece of lawn, with a swimming pool, with all of that. And that implies the cities are just sprawling and sprawling outwards in terms of that. And until there's not a decisive decision to stop that, you are going to have this problem that you don't have a sustainable public transport solution. Charging for road use in a manner that is equitable and transparent. I think the people need to tell us, how do you want to pay for roads? I mean, you're quite willing to pay for cell phone airtime by the minute or second, data by the megabit. You're willing to pay for water by the kiloliter that you use. Okay, some. Electricity, you also per kilowatt hour. You are quite willing to pay for all of those things based on consumption. But as soon as it comes to roads, you do not want to be charged per kilometer that you've traveled. No, that's not fair. No. So, because the technology is there for us to move to GPS based, where I can track every time where you travel, and I can give you at the end of the month an invoice to say, in the past month, you have traveled 312 kilometers. Based on the times of day that you've traveled and the roads, this is your invoice for the month. The problem in South Africa is the cell phone companies, if you don't pay, they switch off your cell phone. If you don't pay me for the roads, I cannot go and close the roads. I cannot go and stand and say, go back, reverse back into your garage. You're not allowed today to get onto the road. And that's the problem we have. I cannot block access to a road because there's so many roads, there's so many points, it will just make it a futile exercise. And that is the challenge we have in South Africa, is people paying for a service. I mean, the same people that refuse to pay for e-toll, they will go through the N1 here. Hey, I'm not paying e-toll. Oh, this thing is from the devil. You know, and they go, boom, they hit Pumlani Plaza. There's a boom. Hey, how much? They pay. They have no problem to pay for, we've got a 100% payment rate at our conventional boom down plazas. As soon as it comes to e-tolls, we've got 30%. So what is the issue? The issue is the one, you cannot proceed without paying because I tell you, no money, turn around. The other one is like, oh no, catch me if you can. And that's the kind of a mentality we have in South Africa that is very problematic. And I think a lot of people, I mean, I can open something here and I can ask you your ID number and I can tell you how much money you owe on e-tolls. And I can show you there's a number of people in this audience that will be sitting here today that are not paying e-tolls, for example. Now, because a lot of time people always, it's like, oh, it's the other people. Those other people, it's not the people that's in the audience that are not paying. But I mean, we can show you big companies, listed companies, that are not paying. And then they've got all these lousy excuses and things like that to say, oh no, the money is going to Austria and all of that. Kuni is here, you can ask him how much he's transferring on a daily basis to Austria. In terms of that, you can ask him how many of the people working for him are Austrians at ETC. Ask him, he's here today. Let him answer you. And then you do your own calculations, and then you see how much of the billion supposedly is flowing to Austria. Okay, that's all from my side. Thanks.
We're going to have Francois Meyer from Transnet give us a view from Transnet on the optimal use of roads and transport stuff. Just one slight change for you. Electricity has a tax on it. So there will be a flow to Treasury, not saying it's going to roads. And this year we're going to end up probably paying a carbon tax, which we believe over a period of, say, 5 years or a decade, will become the 5th biggest tax for the government. It will not obviously compete with personal income tax, VAT, or company tax. Probably won't be as high as petrol tax, but once you've got a carbon tax, that will have an impact on electricity in South Africa, because our electricity comes mainly from coal, and then obviously on fuel prices as well. Francois, please come up. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Can you hear me clearly? Good morning. While Harry is setting me up, thank you. Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. Okay, so Harry approached me last year to give a presentation on a controversial comment I made in an unguarded moment at some stage. And I said, you know, our business cases aren't working. And I'm not talking about Transnet, I'm talking about transportation in general. There's something wrong. And it's perhaps because I've been working with business cases for a very long time. My job at Transnet is to do the long-term planning and to have a look at the feasibility of projects. And before we invest, do we understand what we're in for? And I'm going to, I had to dig deep. I had to think about a lot of stuff that's sitting in the non-technical part of my brain. The philosophy of how you make decisions, even the mystical arts of economics. And I ended up with a hypothesis. And today, allow me to take off my Transnet hat for a bit. I'm not going to talk about Transnet per se. I'm going to just talk about my experience in terms of how we don't get these business cases aligned, because the beneficiaries of a lot of the investments we make, quite often it doesn't correspond to the investors. So the benefits you're getting out of it sometimes leaks out somewhere else, and we don't get the returns coming back. And it's good to see what Louw presented now kind of reflects that as well. A lot of investment into the economy, and you know, we're running dry on the investment side in terms of having the capital available to do what we can term the right thing. Right, so here's my philosophy. My hypothesis is that the beneficiaries and investors are not always the same. And the misalignment in the transport sector leads to suboptimal investments. And we do see that, we observe that in the way that we make decisions, when quite often intuitively you think, well, this is a runner. This is something that we need to invest. It's good for the country. We're probably going to make money out of it. And when you do the business case and you've done the analytics, and let me just tell you, business cases have evolved tremendously over the past 20 years that I've been involved in this, to a little thin document that you just give to the boss and sign, to a stack of documents that covers everything in terms of the risks and what the opportunities are, the technical design, the whole thing, that goes to several committees and eventually to your board, where it's got a slight possibility of being approved. So what's wrong? And maybe just as an introduction, you don't need to see the details there, is to say that, you know, the rail system as it works is quite a closed system. Remember, we don't get any grants, or we don't go to Treasury. Treasury doesn't fund us. We self-fund it. And the way that we work is we invest some money with the prospect of getting some returns. And the returns we reinvest again. So starting out with your investment, we then sweat the assets, we grow the assets, we maintain them, and then we collect the returns in terms of tariffs and fees that we have with our customers, and then we reinvest it. And sometimes you have to, like in any business, there's some cross-subsidization. So you're making a bit more money on the one product, and then you add it to the pot. So it's a nice closed system. There's a bit of leakage, and the leakage is sitting there on the right-hand side. The consequences of what you do is sometimes a benefit to society, or sometimes it's a burden on society. And that's the thing that if I just discount it in the business cases that we do, you sometimes make suboptimal investments. Now, those are things like, if we were not able to, for example, take traffic off the road that shouldn't be on the road. We're talking about freight, for example. If that traffic is actually running on the roads, it's actually generating a lot of congestion, land use, policing, accidents, pollution, emissions, noise, and so forth. That is actually a burden to the economy. And for me, not to make the investment in capacity on rail for those things to be taken there is actually a cost to society that I'm not calculating in my business case. Why? Because the benefits will not accrue to the Transnet income statement. We will not have that benefit coming in on the left-hand side. Now, of course, if you look at road, it's very similar. On the road, of course, there's a lot of cross-subsidization, but a lot of the investments into road operators and the transportation side of things is happening outside of the business entities that are actually running these businesses. So, for example, your infrastructure is only very partially funded if you look on the freight side. They're not paying for the full complement of investment, and that's where SANRAL comes in, and through the taxes and government support that they have to pay that. Also in terms of the maintenance, and roads also got some consequential outputs. So if we were to consider investing in transport infrastructure as a collective, so let's today say we take off our business hats, our individual interest in business, and we say, this group together here, please come up and design a transportation system that will be optimal for South Africa as a whole. I'm pretty sure we'll make different recommendations and we'll design the transportation system differently to what we do when we go back to our offices and we have that very particular mandate from, you need to make money and this is what's in the box. And I think that's the thing that's been bugging me for a number of years in terms of how we put these things together. And there's no mechanism for us to say to policy makers and so forth to say, you know what, we want to make this investment, the business case is, the return on investment is not making the grade. But if we do, we would be saving a lot of money to South Africa Incorporated. And that's that missing thing. And this is why we're making poor judgments sometimes in terms of where we invest our money. Right, so my problem statement, just to reiterate, those who invest are not necessarily reaping the rewards. And capital investment decision-making processes seldom cater for the goodwill or benefits to others. It's just not the thing that you do. It's difficult to quantify sometimes also what the benefits are, the externalities and so forth. And it requires some intuition. And as you know, science is actually what your decision makers need. The intuition side is sometimes not very well tolerated in the corporate world. The transport sector is particularly afflicted by this inability to balance individual business objectives and external costs and benefits. It's not a closed system. It's something that is very open to leakage and all sorts of cross-subsidizations, tax support and so forth. And it's not unique to South Africa, it's everywhere in the world. That's just the nature of this whole thing. We all want to see the cost of logistics to decrease. I think Kuni also said it up front. We all want to see that. But we don't even know what the real costs are. I know Jan Havenga and his team at Stellenbosch, they do a lot of work on the cost of logistics and they give us the graphs and so forth, and I've got a lot of respect for that and we work very close with Jan on that. But it doesn't show the full picture. In fact, logistics cost is a very complicated thing and quite often we discard those things that are difficult to measure. Just on business cases, because that's my business, so if you can endure my hobby. Big decisions in transport infrastructure were made in the 60s up to the 80s. And I'm lucky to have some of those original documents that were the business cases where really big decisions were made in my position. Most of them are in Afrikaans for some reason. ISCO, for example, when they decided to invest in the iron ore export line between Sishen and Saldanha. Thin document like that, hand typed. The graphs are still colored in with colored pencil. And if that particular document were to land at our Capital Investment Committee today, there's absolutely no chance of us making that investment. And yet, they paid handsomely, paid off handsomely over time. It was one of the best decisions ever made. The coal line is another example. Very light business case, no real projections of where the volumes are going to be, and let's just build it and hope it will come. And it turned out also to be a very good investment. So what is wrong? Were the investors in the past just lucky? And we just don't see those bad investments. Or did they possess good intuition that we've somehow lost? Because if we look today, we are much better informed. Forecasting methods have improved tremendously, and the full spectrum of risk and financial modeling have become more sophisticated. So, as I said, lots of documents. We are demanding more from our business cases. And the intuitive judgments of the past is made for much more scientific fact. Don't come here with a intuitive argument about this and that. Give me the facts. Where is it? I think sometimes we make poor decisions, and maybe Kuni also told us we can be controversial, so allow me to be controversial. I think we have lost something. We are making poorer decisions, despite the fact that we are having better information sometimes. And it's not a reflection on the leadership of the companies and so forth, but it's also the type of governance we introduce within large organizations that simply doesn't allow the room for maneuver. Sorry, am I switched off? Okay, can we, right, like this, better? Right, I'll speak with a deeper voice as well. Right, so what's a business case for road to rail? So let me go back to the technical stuff and say, why will it not pass the viability test? So we said, well, we're going to take stuff off the road, but it's just not working. And in this slide, the only thing I want to demonstrate is we've done a lot of work on this. And fact is that even if we do target certain commodities that we believe can quite easily or should actually be on rail, that the business case just doesn't add up. Right, so we have initiatives to say, well, transportation side of things, maybe that won't work, but if we go into the logistics market and we now bring all of the other benefits together, maybe we can make the investment and it will work. But intuitively, that to me is to say, yes, do that, but why is it not making sense on a more basic transportation level? And part of it is also because those commodities that, like containers, automotive, and a few other general freight things, sit in that category within transit that's actually making a loss at this stage. So it's almost like, even if you get the economies of scale, that the more you transport, the more money you will lose in the process. And how do you turn that paradigm around? And I think my logic to that is to say, well, there are some things that we're not really bringing into the calculation. So this is just an expansion of the flowchart I showed you before. And to say that, with the investments, all sorts of investments being made, but we as both road and rail are not paying the full complement, like infrastructure, maintenance, and the externalities or the consequences of hidden cost. The externalities, as I explained, those things that sit on top, cost to society and lost opportunities. Can we quantify that? Is it possible, and who should pay? Well, yes. We've done some work also with University of Stellenbosch and some other sources as to how do you calculate the cost of externalities. And there you have the 6 categories of accidents, congestion, emissions, landway, noise, and policing. And you'll see there's a significant difference between what road introduces as cost and what rail introduces as cost on those things. And the 2 big items there is really accidents on road and emissions. And those things eventually come back to bite you as a government or as a society as a whole. And we also analyzed, it is very similar to what Lau showed earlier, what are the costs of the transport cost components. So how much is this externality cost as if you compare it to the rest? Here we add Durban to Gauteng as an example, and you can see that your externality cost is quite a significant component, the red graph, of the total cost. But of course that doesn't get charged on. And what we also observed that there is roughly an 89% under recovery of infrastructure costs by road haulage, and that these costs are to be borne by other road users and the taxpayer. This is just for freight, by the way. If we do the same on a longer route, Cape Town to Gauteng, there's 91% under recovery, and again, the externality costs are actually quite high. So, what if we were to pay our externality costs? So both road operators and rail operators then had to pay for all of these extra things in some or other form. Then you'd see that it equates to about 15% of the total road cost currently. And on rail, it's about 3%. And with that difference, there's quite a case to be made for saying, well, if we grow our volumes into the future on rail and take a bigger burden on there, we're actually saving a significant amount of money in the process. So how much can we? If this is a conservative estimate of how much we can save, if we just took some of the volumes over a 30-year period and say we shift, instead of what we currently have as a breakdown, our calculations are not based on tons, by the way, it's ton kilometers. From about a 30% share to a 40% share of rail, which means that over a 30-year period, road will continue to grow, by the way. So sorry, road's not going to take away the burden on your side. You'll still have to build more roads and more roads and more roads. But at the same time, it's just that the growth will happen more significantly on rail. And the potential savings that we calculated there is about 250 billion rand, which is not insignificant based on these figures. Unfortunately, this benefit cannot be used in our business cases, and therefore we cannot make that case as Transnet. But I'm sure that case can be made at a higher level. I'm just not sure who's sitting at the higher level and how much money they have to invest in this. Right, so why are we not making the shift? And I think the bottom line is that we've got incomplete business cases, as I showed you. But also you get what you measure. Bottom line driven executives and shareholders measure and drive certain behaviors. Externality costs are sometimes difficult to quantify and especially to agree on. We can have a long debate on how much it is. There's also perceptions and ignorance. It's not my problem. And on the policy side, there's a reluctance to regulate perhaps, but people feel we're already over-regulated and overtaxed. But the bigger question is, how do we regulate? What's the best way of doing that? It's a bit like climate change, I think. We all know, or most of us believe, except for Donald Trump, that it's a real problem. But we don't have the means to address it individually. We actually do need to take it up to a higher level to say, so what do we do now? This is really becoming a big problem. So what can be done? That's my last slide. And I think, just to say that you've got to create awareness. The better decision makers are informed, the better decisions they will make. And I'm not going to stop telling the story about externalities in the business cases. Whether or not it gets believed by the decision makers or whether or not they want to take it into consideration, it's really up to them, but we do need to, all of us, need to start explaining this better. We've got to lobby for change in regulations and controls, and that's simple. We want this to continue the way it is, the underfunding that is going to road, and so forth, and so forth. You've got to start lobbying for behavior change. My own controversial statement, be careful with tax and tolls and mechanisms with a low return and high administrative loss component. And Lau just told us I'm wrong, so I'm prepared to believe that. But it's not the most efficient way necessarily. Tax, in particular, is not the most efficient way of getting around through to where it needs to be spent. You've got to influence public and customer perceptions, and that's especially very productive in countries where there's a lot of discretionary behavior in terms of their ability to pay. You see that, for example, in Norway, where they made a big thing about pollution and so forth, that the Norwegians actually bought into it because they have the ability to pay for something that may cost them a bit more, but they're actually doing the right thing. It's a bit more difficult where people don't have the money to pay. And then collaborate. Not sure. We had a good session the other day where we said, well, we can actually collaborate with road very well. And remember, we're in the next phase of, it's not road versus rail anymore, it's road and rail. We need all modes, and we need to collaborate as far as that's concerned. And that's all from my side. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think we're going to earlier lunch. We'll come back longer. All right, it's lunch. I'm not quite sure it's ready. I did ask them to hurry it up, but I would like to ask, instead of coming back at 1:20, can we try to come back at, say, 1:05 and get going at, say, 1:10 here? That would leave us a little bit more time for the panel discussion. And after lunch, it's Professor Stephen Krijgsman, who you saw last time, and I'm sure you're all waiting eagerly for his presentation. Then it's Peter Copley, and then Kunifa Mark, and then it's the panel discussion, and so on. So let's all go to lunch. Let's get back here at 1:05 and get going at 1:10. Thank you. Carry on right now. But before we do, you can see it's the economic part now again. So this is right down my alley, and I must just give you a bit of a history of economics quickly. Those of you who know about the gigantic Russian May Day parades may appreciate this, but Brezhnev is standing there in the old days at the Russian May Day parade, and the tanks are coming by, the cruise missiles are coming by, the aeroplanes are flying ahead, the soldiers are marching past, the navy is marching past, and then the tanks roll by, and at the end they're 10 men in dark suits. And Brezhnev is looking at this, and he says to his general, he says, "What is that?" He said, "Those are economists. Wait till we unleash them on the Americans." But in honor that I'm an economist, I'm calling up a fellow economist, Professor Stephen Krijgsman. Please come up here. I really enjoyed his presentation last time. I think give him a big hand, and we get this part on the road.
That's it. That's me. Thank you for having me. I need to emphasize that my colleague, Mr. Malrick October and Reginald Khwedi, who were part of this exercise. This is, in fact, part of work we are doing at Stellenbosch University, looking at the relationship between transport and the economy. It seems sort of obvious, no? Closer. So this work is really work in progress. No? We're still trying to figure it out. Understanding this relationship and the dangers sometimes of assuming that transport lead to economic development. I always say be wary of a presentation without a paper. And I can pretty much tell you anything, and flash it up here. And sometimes it can be not entirely true. So with regard to today's presentation, what I will do, I will respond to a couple of emails I got the previous time. The previous presentation we gave, I got very good response, but there were 4 emails specifically that said I should be more controversial. I should, the word was used, attack certain industries and make our statement as universities known. I'm not going to do that entirely, but I am going to be controversial. I should be more direct and point to people that are making mistakes. I'm not going to do that. I will leave out models. I will not discuss a complex relationship between transport and the economy. It's too difficult. No one can understand it. And I will also try and leave out the theory. Those are the comments that I got. But all right, let's focus on the controversial part. No? This is the second of 3 presentations. The first one was a history of road funding in South Africa. Not a lot of people know about that. I listened to the presentations this morning, and I read all these articles. The principle of road funding, where did it all start? There's very little information available. Do we have enough funds? How much should the user pay, etc.? Is a road funding or is a fuel levy sufficient? Should we ring fence our funds? Maybe those are activities that the DOT can consider. This presentation is what is this relationship between roads and the economy? Does roads stimulate economic development? It was mentioned this morning that, look, we have roads, we have economic development. The final presentation is a very interesting presentation where we track people. We've embedded a GPS in their car and they drive around. Every month we send them an invoice and say, this is your road use bill. Now you get a cell phone bill, you get a utilities bill, electricity, water. Well, this is your road use bill. Now pay it. Very interesting results that we've obtained. So let's tackle this first one. Before I start, I need to acknowledge the South African Road Federation, which started all of this, by the way. They funded a project on road funding. They funded a project on road funding. And I think it got the ball rolling for a discussion about roads. By the way, roads is a public asset. Now it belongs to the public, so we should decide. It does not belong to any company. It does not belong to any individual. Since then, we've started with a whole bunch of projects. Those are projects I will refer to some of them. Do yourself a favor. Go onto the internet, Google Adam Smith, download his document. 1,100 pages. He wrote it. You're probably with a quiver, no? You did not have pens or computers. But in fact, if you read his document, this guy, in the 1700s, his entire premise is on roads and transport and how those two elements stimulate economic development. Very interesting article. Very interesting book. Amazing for that time. The World Bank followed up. This is a quote of them. An efficient road system gives a country a competitive edge in moving goods economically. No? Poor accessibility are barriers to economic development. We don't have agriculture, trade, etc. Nevertheless, the contributions are very difficult to quantify. How do we quantify the economic benefits of roads? Let's give it a try. Economic growth and economic development. All governments in the world, except a couple, try and stimulate economic growth. In fact, that's their job, no other job. And typical government objectives include growth in national income and a fair division. A rise in the amount and the variety of final products and goods. The development of a national industrial structure, the establishment and the maintenance of high level of employment. Stuff that we all know. The irony is that governments can do very little. You know, we frequently hear on the television, you know, we will aim for 4% growth. Currently, I don't know, Mike can probably tell you, we're hovering at 0.8%. What can governments really do to stimulate economic growth? You know, they can point to a number, we will achieve this. Well, how? They do claim, particularly in election years, watch them now, that they will stimulate economic growth. Sometimes they mention the words economic development as well. What can governments do, by the way? This is what they can do. Let's leave out monetary and fiscal policy right now. They can invest in education and research. Research about road funding. How much do we need, for example? Safety and security. You know, we've got a hell of a lot of accidents in this country. Let's lower the accidents. They can invest in social services, health, education. They can organize the competition and the regulation of the country so that we do not have monopolies. They can undertake long-term planning. The Chinese are the largest ship builders in the world. They are also, or very soon will be, the biggest ship-owning country. They started with that policy 35 years ago when they started investing in people. That's how long it took them. Or the government can set the necessary institutional, administrative, and social order. You know, a good government. That's what they can do. Or they can invest in public infrastructure. Public infrastructure. We call it economic infrastructure. Electricity, water, transport. Electricity, maybe in order of importance as well. We've heard this morning that water or roads are your veins. Well, the problem with electricity, it's like a heart attack. It's there, then it's gone. Then you don't have electricity. Water is a bit more, you know, it's subtle. It creeps up on you. That's the other problem facing South Africa. Transport is a long-term problem. Before you don't see it, it slowly creeps up on you, and suddenly you're there, and it's terminal. Government can invest in them with roads and public transport. Why are roads very popular to invest in? It's politically highly visible. You know, we need to invest. Probably that backfired on them. Quick turnaround time, relatively quick turnaround time, 3 to 5 years. Planning, design, and construction can be longer. Funding, we have, believe it or not, a stable stream of income from a host of levies. No? There's not only one levy. You pay a CO2 levy if you buy a car, you pay VAT, etc. The list goes on. You can get funding opportunities from international banks, less expensive often compared to electricity. Easy to build, relatively easy to build. No? Really not that difficult compared to the other infrastructure. Ironically, it also does not involve the state. No? They plan, but then they hand it over to consultants and the private sector to construct, and often to maintain very well. So roads are a popular economic infrastructure. What went wrong? How does this process work? Let's assume we've got two towns, two neighborhoods, two cities, whatever. We call the one town origin, the other one town destination. Those are the two towns. No connection between them. Without any connection, every little town, every little neighborhood has got its neighborhood, its catchment area, and it trades with itself. Small catchments, not a lot of growth, etc. So you build a road. You connect the two towns. Suddenly the catchment increases. Now they can trade, they can specialize, they can produce a bit more, they can sell it. You build another road. Catchment slightly increases again. You keep on building roads, or you provide infrastructure. The catchment increases, but there's a diminishing return. Every additional road do not provide so much additional benefit. You keep on investing, slowly it increases, but you run out of benefits. In the end, you provide your final road, catchment does not really increase. You may even decide, well, I'm going to chuck all the roads and I'm going to provide rail, much more environmentally sustainable, can transport stuff much more cheaper. That's how roads support economic development. It increases the catchments of areas. It allows people and goods to travel from origin to destination. But there's a very big but for that to happen. It does not happen automatically. The two chiefs in the various towns, the two principals, the two bosses, they need to want to trade. No? They need to have the policies in place. They say, we will trade. It is okay to trade. One of the towns might decide, we don't want to trade. The funds to build the road should be cheaply available. No? If not, you've got a problem. The cost of the road and the cost of road use should not erode the benefits. If it's a very expensive road, the benefits of trade diminishes. And the two towns should have some absolute or relative advantage, something they can trade. Their people should be educated and trained to do something, or they should have the land or the capital or something, the resources to trade. They need to be in place for economic growth to take place. So roads may support economic development. We've heard this time and time again. Good roads have got direct effects. It lowers the VOC, the vehicle operating costs, and the travel time. More money is available to produce and spend. Now, companies have more money. Just-in-time production and supply chains, you require less inventory. You can deliver it, less space. All of that leads to an increase in output and productivity. It may even stimulate what we call indirect effects, employment creation. Cities can become places of innovation. You have certain benefits of people living in a city, many benefits, shorter travel times. All of that combined to what we call economic growth. And there's a definition of economic growth. Poor roads has got the exact opposite effect. But with poor roads, we mean congested roads. The road physically, the quality of the road is poor, or the roads are too expensive. So it's not only one element of the road. There are various elements that one needs to consider. And our government responded. Now, we've got really, really good plans. In fact, fantastic plans. NatMap. In fact, our government's policy is an infrastructure-led growth policy. The new growth path, etc. A statement not so long ago about turning South Africa into a construction site. Nothing wrong with that statement. In fact, it's okay. South Africa's road network, you saw this morning, it's something we should be really proud of. We should not be proud of our electricity or our water supply, but our road network, is quite good. It's, in fact, very good. This is another way of putting it. All the countries in the world, and by the way, there are two numbers for countries in the world, either 246 or 195, but officially 195 countries, a couple of states. All the countries in the world, I've listed them cumulatively, starting with the United States, the biggest road network, and you've heard the presenter this morning say we've got roughly 750,000 kilometers, quite good. The 10th biggest in the world, bloody good, I think. This is another one, the vehicles per thousand of the population. That's South Africa. By the way, the previous one is the BRICS countries listed as well. Of the BRICS countries, we are the worst off in terms of road network length. That's Namibia. This is another one. This is vehicles per 1,000 of the population. Old figures, not entirely up to date. Again, all the countries listed. That's us, 165 vehicles per 1,000 of the population. You've got a big network, big road network. You've got relatively few people using that road network. You know, what's the end result? You've got an expensive product and few people buying that product. The cost will be more expensive. Yeah, it's not difficult. What is it worth? You've heard this morning and at previous presentation, and there's no real study now. I think SANROL has done their best to quantify the road network. Maybe, again, something the DOT should take a look at. Roughly 2 million rand, or sorry, 2 trillion, many zeros there. So if you divide it by the number of kilometers, we get roughly to 2.67 million rand per kilometer, but I think that might be an underestimation. This is a fantastic asset, something that we've built up over years. Problem is you don't always know when it is deteriorating and when it may be too late. But maybe we should not measure the value of our road network simply in terms of the value, the physical asset value. We should measure it in terms of what it does and what it is supposed to do and the problems we are experiencing with that road network. Now, congestion in Cape Town, for example. Another interesting slide, how do we do on taxes, by the way? Well, we're roughly in the middle of the world. By the way, India, Brazil, and China is above us. They collect more. Fuel is more expensive, and Russia is below us. We're in the middle of the world. We've moved up slightly, but I've got another figure here for all the countries, and we've moved up a bit. But we are pretty much slap bam in the middle of the world in terms of the tax that we charge on fuel and the price of fuel, not the entire tax that a road user pay. And if you look at an index, we got this one yesterday from I need to find the source, the Global Competitiveness Index, and they rate countries in terms of their competitiveness. And out of interest, we looked at our road network. Of all our infrastructure, our roads are the best. In fact, this is based on interviews, and people do not consider our roads to be poor. In fact, they consider South African roads to be quite good. How does the average South African, we've got all of that. Now, let's look at the average South African, how we spend our money. And again, we heard something this morning. Quite a big chunk of our money goes to housing, our electricity bills, it's 32%. No? Transport, 16.3%. The average, there's no such thing as an average South African, but the average South African as summarized and provided by SANROL. Not by SANROL, sorry, by Stats SA. This is the average European. We spend 16.3% on transport. They spend 13% on transport, 3% less, the average European. But they spend a hell of a lot less on housing, by the way. We spend 33%, they spend 23%. Problem is, if you look at poor South Africans, they spend a lot more on transport, getting to work, getting back from work. Average monthly salary of 3,500 rand, their transport cost, transport percentage, what the hell? I do not understand those figures, it went wrong. I think it's a rough 23%. I don't, yeah. I'm not entirely sure what happened there. So let's look at this. Let's take a step back. Now, the finances, we've got an extensive road network, big road network, relatively few customers. Now, you do the calculations. You know, where do you get your money? You get your money from the customer using the road. The transport costs, South Africans are paying a lot for transport. We've got congested cities as well, you know. It's got nothing to do with roads, our congested cities, by the way. Quality of our roads, well, the world does not seem to think that our roads are that big a problem. In fact, if you ask any person from Africa, look at the roads in South Africa, they will tell you, you've got fantastic roads. So well done. We've done a good job there. Now I want to take you to the relationship between roads and transport. But first, I will look at the relationship. No, let's continue. We obtained a lot of data from the World Bank, from the International Monetary Fund, the International Road Federations, United Nations, etc. And I'm not going to build a model. I'm going to illustrate the relationship between GDP per capita and various indicators. The first one is roads. No? GDP per capita. If I plot all the roads in the world, I plot all the countries, we've got all the data. I think the data, the year is 2016, and I fit a regression line. Completely what you should not do, by the way, in a paper, but I can because this is a presentation. And I plot South Africa as well. Note our position below the line. No? Note our position. Roads and GDP per capita. Well, the first thing that you should notice is that the regression line does not really explain that relationship between those two variables quite strong. We'll get back to that. The model implies that GDP per capita starts at a certain thing and then increases for every kilometer or for every unit of road that you add. The GDP increases. But, you know, why not? Look at South Africa, look at all the BRICS countries, look at the United States. We obtained, by the way, we can transform that using a log-log transformation, and we've transformed that. The interesting thing about a log-log transformation, it tells you the elasticity. What is the elasticity? How much? If you increase roads per capita, if you increase roads, the number of roads per kilometer, how much will our GDP increase? Roads or transport always have a very low elasticity. If we increase the number of roads in South Africa with 100%, the GDP per capita will only increase by 57%. Let's go on to the next one. Oh, by the way, if you take that and you try and fit a curve to all the countries, again, I'm not telling you absolutely the truth. We are playing with a couple of figures. You find an inverse curve. It means it tapers off. No? It tapers off. In fact, it might turn negative. By the way, that's the World Bank's finding. Slightly different scales, but they've got the exact same finding. So roads do support economic development, particularly in developing countries, middle to high income countries. You can read the report yourself. But let's look at education. The World Bank sent us the same information. If you now fit a regression line, the regression line is much stronger between education and economic growth. And if you now fit a curve, 5 minutes left, that curve seems to be like a power curve. No? The better education becomes, the stronger your GDP becomes. We even obtained information on the Logistics Performance Index, another index that the World Bank, it's an index, no? So it's a bit subjective. Collects, and we plotted South Africa. Again, we're below the curve. Note that we are in all cases below the curve. Very strong regression line again. 51% of the variation in GDP is explained by our logistics performance, and they look at various factors, not only infrastructure. Again, if you fit a curve, a power curve, no, means the better you becomes, the more strong your GDP will be. And then the World Bank sent us this one. Very interesting. They collect information on your, that's not me, by the way. They collect information on the quality of your government, on your government. No? How good, how do they fight corruption, control of corruption, voice and accountability, etc. And we selected one. We've got all of them. By the way, do yourself a favor. You can go to that website, download it, plot it, see where South Africa is. It makes for a good horror story. So we've plotted this. And we got the best regression line of all of them. Now 70% of your GDP is explained by this one, corruption. And again, if you fit a line, you see a power line, the better it becomes, you know, again, the better. Again, South Africa is, now we're on the line, by the way. So we chucked all of them together. And we tried to explain economic development in South Africa. But there's first something else I need to show you. If you look at all of those graphs, you probably won't be able to make it. You'll see that we are below the regression line. The way to interpret that is we are performing with the infrastructure that we have, with all the information we have, with all the education funding, we are performing relatively poor compared to our peers. There are countries with a lot less that are doing better than us. It seems like we are stuck in a rut. We have a lot of tools, we have a lot of technology, but we are not performing as we should. Ideally, you want to be above that regression line, or at least on the regression line. But we are on the wrong side of the fence. We are not performing as we should with what we've got. If you're on the right, it means you are performing poorer than most. South Africa is in all instances on the right, no? On the line with regression. Maybe we are not living up to our potential. Our roads are important, no? Extremely important. I need to close. And they will stimulate economic development. We've taken all those variables and we've put them into one model. And that model illustrates that if we can fix our institutional structure, our government structure, roads will drive economy through trade, through exports, etc. But without that, it won't. Here are the three findings from our paper. We need positive economic externalities. It means if we build a road, someone should take the benefit and transfer it into productivity. You need trained people, good education, skills, technology, entrepreneurship. They need the benefits. You need them in your country to translate the benefits of increased access into productivity. You need investment factors. You need capital, and the cost of that capital is extremely important. You need the right infrastructure at the right place at the right time. Very important. If your infrastructure is expensive or the state borrows money, you might have a short-term gain, but in the future you will tax people and it will crowd out private sector investment. No? You'll push them out. So your long-term effects will be a problem. So the cost of your infrastructure and where you get the money is extremely important in the long term. Short term, you can get gains, but in the long term, it will come back. Political factors, probably actors. Yeah, the name is actually appropriate. You need a very good political framework and institutional structure that is conducive to economic development, that understands the policies and principles. In fact, it is so strong, that World Governance Index is so strong in our model that it overrides everything else. You fix that, and the rest seem to fall into place, ironically. You need accountability, measurable outcomes, clear and specific policy. If you've got them, the rest seems to fall into place. World Bank found this as well. You know, it's not new to us. You know, we're not rocket scientists. We rely a lot on our looks. These results for both kinds of infrastructure indicate that infrastructure investment are not sufficient by themselves. We can flatten South Africa and build roads from origin to destination. It will not stimulate economic growth unless the other factors are present. So get those other factors right, and it may work. However, infrastructure can be a productive investment in economies with high levels of physical and human capital. That is my last slide. Thank you.
I'm told that economists will confuse you. While we were talking about roads, we ended up talking about governance too. But ultimately, Peter Copley is going to come speak now. But just a little bit of news I just got. As from 2 years from today, there will be no more Airbus A380s made. They've cancelled it, and when they're finished, they wouldn't have met their target of making at least 1,000. And they're certainly not going to make a break even because they needed, I think, 1,500 of them. So just while we had a transport forum, that's just an interesting snippet of information. Peter, please come up and get your presentation.
It's my privilege to be here. Why am I here? Harry pulled me out from under the trees of Irene, where I live. And I think why Harry pulled me out was because of a presentation that I made last year to the Road Federation and the International Road Federation on the effects of government policy on economic performance. if you bother to go onto Harry's website, you will find this presentation, then you will find the presentation I made then, and in between you'll find a whole lot of conversations. Conversations from OTA, from the AA, from road federations, from various other bodies. So what I'm supposed to be talking about is, so that's why it says slide 1 of 57. Don't worry about that, they're only about 10. Where do I begin? So my thanks to Harry, my thanks to all of you for listening to me, giving me this opportunity. What I do is I sit at home and I watch the passing show. If Eskom permits me, I watch the conversations going backwards and forwards on the internet. When Eskom doesn't permit me, then I watch TV. We'll start. Where will we start? For a slideshow. No, they aren't there, okay. So what I was asked to talk about, according to the title, is how much do we need? And the reality is that if you look at the conversations, we don't know how much we need. We don't know how much we need to look after the network. Lowe spoke this morning about the SANRAL network, very authoritative, and that's how much we need for the national network. But for the whole network, how much do we need? And if you look at how much do we get from the fuel levy, we don't actually know. It's quite interesting to watch the different conversations coming from different places, and the reality is we don't know. So I stress that these are personal views and are not necessarily representative of SARF or its members' road funding policy, which is tolling, augmenting a dedicated road financing fund. And so I commend Lowe's presentation from this morning and from last month for the actual detailed figures of what you need. Boom. This is South Africa's economic growth from about 1984. And I'll try this thing. I can't. Challenged by technology. And the pointer? Okay. And the pointer? In the middle. Yes. Prior to 94, we went up and down, up and down. We were out of control. We were under sanctions. We were having windfalls with gold prices and platinum prices, and then we were dropping. Subsequent to 94, here, up we went for 13 years. That was growth in GDP of 0.5% per annum, consistently. We were doing very well from 94 to 2007. Then in 2007, down we started. And what happened in 2007? The fundamental was that we shifted from market-driven policies to populist policies. With those market-driven policies, we were developing Maputo Toll Road, Bakwena, the N3, Maputo Port, Gautrain, solar panels in the Northern Cape, wind in the Eastern Cape. We were letting the market drive us, and we were doing very, very well. This fundamental choice was to our detriment, and down we went. Boom. If we bring it back to petrol price predictions, if South Africa's petrol price continues to increase in line with historical trends, it could double in the next 6 years. This is according to data compiled by Solidarity. Looking at the historical petrol price data from '76 to the present, Solidarity senior researcher Paul Jabert calculated that the average time it has taken for the petrol price to effectively double over the past few decades. According to the research, the petrol price has doubled every 6.5 years, since the 1980s. Taking this trend into account and looking forward, this means that the petrol price in Gauteng could hit 28 Rand by the middle of 2020. Those are his figures of how it's increased. And if we put that into a picture, it looks like that. So you can't see my little curve. My little curve goes up there, and it goes up there. And if we put that against CPI, here is the curve going up exponentially, and here is CPI going like that. So we are exceeding CPI substantially with the price of fuel. Basically, the price of fuel is going up at the price of fuel is going up at 23% per annum, and that means that the fuel levy is also going up at about 23% per annum. And if we move to this one, this shows the South African economy as it was at that peak and what it now is. The slices haven't changed much, but the actual economy has contracted by about 30% as we've moved from market-driven policies to populist policies. And if you look at that in a bit more detail, what has the total, that slide, down there. Sorry, I have to see this. These colors are not good, and I apologize for that. If we look at the total economy, it has contracted by 30%. The figures down here are those that have contracted by less than 30%, those up there more than 30%. So the order of shrinkage from worst to least worst lies in, firstly, electricity, gas and water by a third, mining and quarrying by a third, agriculture, forestry and fishing by 30%, 32%. Let's stop there. The main drivers of the South African economy have contracted by a third because we have left market-driven policies. We have tried to have mining charters. They aren't well received by the market. We have compensation of land, expropriation of land without compensation. They aren't received well by the market. And these uncertainties are what is bringing the economy down. So what do governments do when economies start contracting? They need the money, so they start pushing the taxes up. And we have all seen the taxes go up: personal income tax, companies tax, VAT, and the fuel levy will also continue to go up. The interesting part about this is that I was criticized by this by South Africans who said that in Rand terms we're doing quite well. For a person who's employed, paid in Rands, yes, you are doing quite well down here. But in terms of the overall economy, no, we are not doing very well. And that mining and quarrying, which was the traditional economic force of South Africa, the commodities, has dried up, is drying up. There's a vacuum being created. Now, I can have two things that could happen to that vacuum. The West could come in, start mining again, pay taxes. China could come in, bring their own workforce, not pay taxes. So then it becomes a sort of global choice. Do we ally ourselves to China, or do we ally ourselves to the West? And we're at that cusp at the moment. So South Africa's growth, what happened in 2007? We moved from a market-driven economy to a populist-driven economy. And unfortunately, down we went. And we're still going down. Hopefully, we say we're going to turn, and there are signs of that happening. If you see that government yesterday decided not to police the internet. I think that's a tremendously positive sign about how they might be responding to free market forces. Again, sorry for this curve, but there goes the curve. Increase of 23%. So what we have seen, whichever way we look at the price of fuel at the pump in rand terms, and hence the rates of increase in the two main components of the tax on fuel, namely the fuel levy itself and the road accident fund, it has been increasing at about 23% per annum since '76, and it's now exponentially accelerating. And I'd like to compare this with the concession toll roads, which in terms of contractual agreement can only increase tolls by a maximum of CPI every year. And the concessionaires and Sanral policy prefers to increase at 0.75%, 0.75 of CPI. So which would you choose? Between a fuel price that can just go on and on and on, just with the Minister of Finance saying we're going to increase it, or tolls which are contractually restricted for 30 years. Fundamental conditions approved by Parliament when road tolling was first approved. There had to be a free alternative maintained in the same condition as if it were the primary road. Funds raised through road tolling could only be spent on the roads they were collected on. And these were very sound conditions, all of which have gradually disappeared with time. And perhaps it is time to revisit and reintroduce them, particularly for the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project. There's an inbuilt constraint in spending funding wisely if these are applied. And a fuel levy has no such upper constraint. And I think if we focus on the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project, if we were to spread the word that the money being collected, the tolls being collected, were only to be spent on the GFIP, we might get a difference in attitude of users towards a greater willingness to pay rather than just dispersing money to government. Bloomberg observations, we have been talking about this. South Africa has the 43rd highest petrol price in the world at 13.67, which is low down on the list compared to some European countries. However, as with 2014's ranking, South Africans still pay the biggest proportion of their annual income and fuel costs, with 4% of average annual salaries going to petrol fees. The closest country to South Africa in these terms is Greece, which pays 3.3%. South Africans face a lot of pain at the pump, which is exacerbated by how much gasoline they consume. And that's the reason for our tax revolt. Mr. Ziri is now talking about a tax revolt. There were persons talking about tax revolts 5 years ago. Historically, there were approximately, where to now? And I'm going to shift from that thing where we need more money and more money and more money to what do we do about the road network itself. Historically, there were approximately 36 bodies building rural roads in South Africa when considering the independent and self-governing territories and their respective roads, agricultural and defence departments. Calls from residents of deeper rural areas of South Africa were for road access as their highest priority. And this was understandable, recognizing that residents lived in a spatially spread out framework, needing access to and from places of economic concentration. An inevitability of this arrangement was that many duplicated and in some instances, frankly, unnecessary roads were constructed. So we have the 10th or 11th longest rural network in the world, which is not congruent with our economic performance at about position 42. There's a need to look critically to the need to rationalize and shorten the overall length of the network. I'm not talking about the national network. I'm talking about the overall network. The central placed areas of Christola and Lush lend themselves to application in a more politically stable and regional country. So what we had, and I think we can blame this on apartheid, certainly, one of the things we can blame on apartheid, we had these regional governments all over the place, all building their own systems. And everyone wanted to get to places of economic concentration. But those places of economic concentration were dictated by political boundaries. And what we need to try and do in a single country with 9 provinces is rationalize that network. I'm not going to be doing it, so I look towards the younger parties amongst us. There's a need to undertake the forensic audit into the fuel levy proposed by ALTA so that we can actually understand how much money is being taken in tax through the fuel levy and understand where it's going to. A need exists to re-ring-fence revenue generated by tolls collected on a facility to that facility, particularly on the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project, together with a national provincial study to locate roads, both existing and sometimes new, which meets the needs for both personal mobility and economic necessity described for central placed areas. The fundamentals of effective transport planning remain land use, transport, and energy. This gets a bit too scientific. A need exists to use both the rural economic development model in determining priorities as well as the highway design and maintenance model. The red model favors consumer surplus, whereas the highway design and maintenance model favors producer surplus. South African policy currently looks only to the HDM model. So what we have in South Africa is a decision-making system for roads that pulls all the resources into the higher order facilities and leaves the lower order facilities high and dry. They get forgotten. And we need to balance that in terms of determining our priorities. To toll or not to toll then becomes the far more important question of to be or not to be. My last slide. We have moved to a situation where government is having to guarantee everything. And what gets the press is Eskom. Eskom. And we all know that Eskom is calling for ever more guarantees. SAA, wherever SAA might be, that is the rough order of guarantees on the South African government. Interesting part to me about this was that historically, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the highest was Transnet. Transnet needed the biggest government guarantee as we fought to keep the rail system going. And then gradually, Treasury said we aren't going to guarantee Transnet anymore. And Transnet have responded magnificently. They have cut their cloth, their suit, to match the cloth. But quietly, Sanral has gone up there to number 2. So we are in a problem situation that if Sanral can't get its finances sorted out, we will have another credit downgrade. Boom. So I hope not. Thank you for listening. What I have said, and this is a sort of unknown, recognizes that South Africa's retail banks have recently been adjudged in London to be the best in the world. It's one of our greatest resources. And so we need to use that resource for future potential projects. We need more PPPs. And I'll leave that sitting out in the ether. Thank you. These are all the conversations where you can get the actual price when you go onto the, and then that's the other presentation about whether we want market-driven policies or populist policies. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Peter. Well, I think you guys need some cheering up. Yes, we do. Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, those of us who are dead already, it's okay. It won't pain us much. But those of us who are still alive, we do need a bit of cheering up. And I've recently come across somebody on Twitter who is very, very unorthodox, to call it that. And she's the super justice woke warrior and so on. And she's recently come up with this amazing idea that if all the feminists in the world were to join ISIS, they could make it a progressive organization. But be that as it may, Kuni is going to give us the final presentation. And for Mark, that's the person that paid for our food, so you better clap very nicely. And then we are going to have a panel discussion. I'll just ask all the panelists just to bring your chair to the front when we start. Bring your chair with you if you can, or a chair close by here in the front. Thank you very much. Kuni?
Can everybody hear me? Great. Sorry. Okay, great. So this won't be a long presentation, and I think you have heard a lot of facts, a lot of figures, a lot of analysis done already, some hard work. But I think what we do realize is that this is quite a complex topic. It is quite complex to actually understand how much money do we need. It's quite complex to understand how do we care for our network, this massive asset that we have. And I think from where I sit, I think sometimes problems don't get resolved by analysis. They actually get resolved by deduction. And I think what we do need to do is we need to start looking at what are we seeing, what are we experiencing, and then taking small steps at a time to actually start rectifying and turning the ship around. So who's ETC? We were established in 2010. We are a special purpose vehicle. We tendered on the GFIP Phase 1 project at that point in time, the Gauteng Open Road Tolling System. Contrary to public belief, no Guptas were involved. We were given a clean bill of health through the tender process by the Auditor General earlier this year. And I think government actually achieved what it set out. I mean, I have to actually I think congratulate Sanral for what they have achieved. I mean, what Sanral set out to achieve is to bring technology to South Africa that didn't exist at that point in time. They also brought knowledge and experience to South Africa, and that knowledge and experience got transferred to South Africans. So today in ETC, we employ 1,200 people, no foreigners. They are all South Africans working on a South African project, and it's state of the art. People working at ETC are in high demand because of the system complexity, because of the sophistication, because of the technology we use. And so from my side, apart from road user compliance, I think that this project has been an immense success. The problem that and the snag that we hit is what I interesting slide. This is yesterday. It was, and so how do we deal with congestion? And I think this is what this presentation tries to explain is how have we been able to unlock congestion? What is the value of that? Because the value of the roads is quite important, but to make the economy flow, to make people effective, to make people efficient, I think has got a massive price tag to it. So this is the network that the GFIP. In blue, you'll see basically a lot of the GFIP network. What you see in the red is actually phase 2 that's not being built. And those phase 2 and phase 3 has got a fundamental impact in our lives, because what you will find is on the southwestern side of Gauteng, the Soweto area, most people actually have to travel to the eastern part of Gauteng to actually be productive, have a work, find a job. And without these new roads that we need to build, traveling cost increases exponentially, and at the same time we also do not ensure that we have investment attracted to those areas. So what did the GFIP project achieve? I think it was a fantastic project, brainchild at Sunroll. We improved interchanges, road congestion was improved, bridges were widened. I think it was a massive upgrade of our system, and it's really world class. The idea was obviously to make sure that we maintain the growth trajectory of Gauteng. Nobody could foresee that electricity would be the real anchor for us, dragging us down. But at that point in time, it was really important to maintain the growth trajectory in Gauteng. And Gauteng is the powerhouse of Africa. It contributes 40% of GDP in South Africa, and therefore it is also really important not only to our economy, but also to economies close by. So what potential did the GFIP actually unlock? The idea is to give you a vision of what it did unlock, and remember that this is only phase 1 of 3 phases that have been constructed. The Midrand development, I think everybody knows how Midrand is actually exploding. The Atterbury Group invested 800 million rand in a new industrial park. What we have seen in the Midrand waterfall development area is 980, almost 1 million square meters of leasable land. It has really ensured that we attract investors. The Mall of Africa is the biggest mall in South Africa currently, comprising 131,000 square meters. Quite interesting is that on this GFIP network, 10 of South Africa's major malls are all at close proximity to the GFIP. So the GFIP, the network really attracts investors and unlocks the ability for investors to get goods to and from those areas. This you will see at the ETL Facts website. It's very similar to the pictures that Louw has shown. This is the Allendale off-ramp between 2007 and 2018. And I think it needs to play twice for people to realize what massive investment this has unlocked. If you look at this investment, it's roughly about 30 billion rands worth of investment that this has unlocked. Which I think previous speakers also referred to the Linwood shopping development, the Menlyn Park shopping development. Investors that I've spoken to and economists actually evaluate that the total Menlyn main development is probably close to the order of about 100 billion rand that it's unlocked. And here you can see this. Obviously, the Gasfontein off-ramp was upgraded, as well as the Atterbury off-ramp, and this whole main development expanded, as well as new businesses along this road. Again, Linwood Road, just up the further down the road from Menlyn Shopping Centre. This was the Menlyn Bridge development. You know, major companies have got businesses there, and this is the potential that it attracted, the investors that it attracted. Moving towards the southeast of the city, towards Soweto. This is near the Golden Highway, the R101 N1 crossing, and you can see how it is actually facilitated investment and growth into that community. And what this means is that people do not have to travel 50 or 60 kilometers a day to get to work. This enables people to get and stay closer to places where they work. This is the Rivonia off-ramp. The Rivonia off-ramp, I think, was also quite instrumental in attracting the investment of the final shopping centers that were built there. So what are the macroeconomic benefits that we've seen? First, I think there were jobs created across a wide variety of industries. It is estimated that the GFIP in 2012, 2013 in the study, that it would create about 2.1 million job opportunities in total. Indirect jobs are created by industries that it attracts. You can imagine the jobs that it created by just the investments that has been made. A study done by the University of Cape Town School of Economics showed that the GFIP at that point in time would have had a cost-benefit ratio of 8.4. What that means is that for every 100 Rand that you invested, the return would have been 840 Rand. And the total net present value benefits was in the order of about 210 billion Rand. This graph is quite important, I think, as part of the study. And this is the cost of congestion. This links to the first couple of slides, where what you will see in the blue graph here is the business time saving cost, the equivalent of that. And the equivalent, the saving that the GFIP unlocked, because it has greater efficiency and greater effectiveness, is in the order of about 207 billion by 2030. Barry Standish did a study, and I think I want to share some of the concepts with him. This is also not Sunroll propaganda or ETC propaganda. This is in the open market, and I think it's quite important for people to realize what the benefit is. They took a sample, an average road trip between Soweto and Isando on a daily trip, and what they calculated is the cost of what it would cost every year in terms of a trip. So the cost of morning peak traffic would increase by about R1.90 annually, and by 2018 it would cost about R9.51 per trip. With the upgrades, the morning savings that was calculated was in the region of about R19.50. 14 minutes saving on time saving. And then, quite importantly, if you now deduct the e-tag tariff, the toll tariff, which at that point in time was R8.64, and this is an uncapped rate. I do want to remind people that currently there's a cap. So once you get to the 266 Rand per month, you do not pay more regardless of how many trips you make. But this is quite a telling slide for me, because what it means is that because we can't implement phase 2, because we can't grow the network, the average road user, the people that use a taxi on a daily basis, are actually out of pocket by about R10.90 in a trip per day. And so we have to find solutions to finance new projects. We have to find ways to actually build the phase 2 and phase 3 of the GFIP, in my view. And as we stand today, the impact is not neutral. The impact is actually negative. People are paying more. It's costing them more in terms of transport because we do not have the network in place. And this is including paying for toll. We spoke about this slide, and I think this is quite telling. The road trip that was evaluated was from Soweto all the way through to Isando. It is estimated that the GFIP, when it was fully operational, so if it was fully operational, would actually contribute about 7.7 billion in 2013 in terms of time saving. So we can imagine if an average person in South Africa spends 14 to 18 days in traffic, what that cost is to the economy. So in conclusion, I think what we do have to realize is that South Africans are actually out of pocket by us not being able to build the further phases of the GFIP. South Africans are paying more to travel because we have less efficient roads, less efficient networks. And the congestion is building again simply because the next phases should have been built and it needs to cope with the growth that we have. I think what is also quite important for me to highlight is, so what is the cost of tolling? If you look at the cost of tolling, you'll see that it's about 19 cents for every 100 rand generated in GDP. Toll revenue is very small compared to the household income, 25 cents for every 100 rand earned. And it's got a very small impact in terms of food. So the study showed that it's about between 4 and 17 cents for every 100 rands worth of goods delivered. I really believe that tolling is a progressive way of doing business. In my view and in my daily life, I get audited by the Auditor General continuously. It is really important for me to state this to you as a listener, to say that the money is fully accounted for, which means the money is ring-fenced. The money is probably not ring-fenced in terms of the GFIP only, but tolling projects are ring-fenced by law. And so for South Africans to use the GFIP to pay a toll fee, actually they know exactly where that money is going. The money and the tax are going into the project for the right reasons. Whereas I think some South Africans would say and challenge, you know, where their normal tax would go to on a normal basis. Thank you very much.
Discussion, and we can just ask all the presenters to please come up here. There's a chair or two in front here, and we'll just take them.
My name is Richard Bennett. I'm involved in a number of areas of property development. I also represent or chair the Developers Forum for Power. My question really is around the bigger picture thinking, and when you talk of funding and the motivation for funding, one of the comments that was made in the last presentation was that a lot of people living in Soweto end up moving east and north. And this begs the question, we obviously need improved infrastructure for those movements, or alternatively, stop moving people away from where they live and bring development to where people live for their employment. There's ample opportunity for that to happen, but we seem to keep on going around this exercise of determining what we might save if we were to improve the road in moving people without testing the alternative, which says, what will we save if we were to take the opportunities closer to where people live? Thank you.
We're going to take 2 or 3 questions, and then the panel can comment because of the shortage of a mic. Anybody else with a question on funding, priorities, all those sort of things? On money side, if we can call it that. Professor Walters.
Just an observation. There's lots of comments about the fact that only 30% people pay for the G4 system. How many people are prosecuted on this thing for not paying? Because you can deny them, you can put them in jail. I mean, you can't deny them the road, you can put them in jail.
I can't, somebody else can. Any other questions? I'll put that more on the general side.
Finance.
Yep, sorry. Bring the mic to you, sir. Relax. We've only got one.
Charles Kukkerling from PTV Group. Just in question of the fuel levy itself. That portion that is contributed to the fiscus, how big a portion is actually reallocated to road and road maintenance? And how much goes into just the pool of funds?
I know who will answer that.
Okay, my comment is based on the presentation that Lowe did when he says that if you have an electric car, you are currently not paying anything because you don't buy petrol. But my question is that what is the plan of making sure that those people pay? Can you please maybe consider options like increase maybe the annual disc, or the annual services that somebody needs to pay on an annual basis so that they can be able to pay. You can also consider maybe charging based on how many kilometers does a person drive in a year so that you can be able to charge those people, because you mentioned that there's about 1 million cars that people have at the moment using electric cars.
All right. I think on the fuel side, Peter said a lot, but I'm also very, very convinced that Lowe wanted to say something because I saw those figures of yours earlier. So maybe you take the fuel direct that question.
I think in terms of the question, if you look at how much in terms of the fuel levy that's generated and how much goes back, I think as you've seen there, probably if you look at in the order of the treasury allocations that are linked to transport, remember this now includes bus subsidies, because the public transport system in terms of subsidizing buses and all of that, if you count all of that, because it's all transport related. In terms of the services, you'll see that from the slide there, in terms of the numbers, virtually 90% of what they currently generate is going back. In some years, they reallocate 105, 110% back. The problem we have is, in reality, how much of that money ends up on actual projects. And I think that's the question that one needs to ask is, where is all that money? Because if you look at it, Sunroll gets about, between us, the provinces and the metros, the allocation that comes to Sunroll is about 1/3 of the total that goes to those 3 spheres, yet we are responsible for nearly 70 to 75% of the construction activity. So the question you need to say is, but where is the rest of that money that is allocated disappearing to? The metros, the 8 metros, they get a direct allocation from the fuel levy. If you go to the metros, you'll see they do not spend it on roads only. They reallocate it to all other services at the metro. And those are the things that one needs to look at, is where actually does that money end up that gets allocated to roads?
I know, Peter, you want to say something?
Just expanding on what Rose said, he's absolutely right. And I think that's why what I just calling for is a forensic audit of the fuel levy so we can get our arms around it. Because there are other obscurities that historically vehicle manufacture, the Mercedes-Benz plants and those were also funded from the fuel levy. And reality is we as laypersons, I don't know. So we need to ask the question and try and find out the real answer.
Just on process, I think if you look at any tax up, with one or two exceptions, the road accident fund is one, TV license is another, it goes into the general fiscus. Then you have different authorities collecting taxes. So you have the provincial, which is very small. They normally have gambling taxes and vehicle licenses. Then you have the metros, which collect a property tax. And in effect, if you think about it, electricity and water are also in effect a very good tax because they make a big profit margin on that. And then they allocate on the metro side. So one of the reasons you would be paying, for example, a property tax is that your local authority would build a road or finance a road past your property so you can get to the shops or to work and everything. So I think we need to not look just at the fuel tax, we must look at the whole thing. And then just on that whole thing, South Africa's got the 10th highest personal income tax burden in the world. It's the 5th highest company tax burden in the world. It is in the top 40 just now with the VAT. So on excise duties is a little bit down. Overall, excluding social security taxes, I don't take that into account because that's like the pension fund. Ours is private. Chile and Australia is private, so it's difficult. If you include that, we would be in the top 12 countries with tax to GDP burden quite easily. If you take all the other revenue that governments make, for example, train revenue, toll revenue, hordes of other stuff they do, the royalties, and so on, because royalties are not regarded as a tax always. You add up all of that, South Africa is really also still in the top 15 countries in the world. We tax like a real first world country. The problem is that the outcomes of that tax or the delivery of that tax is very diluted. And at the moment, our civil servants have about the 4th or 3rd, but let's say between 3rd and 5th, highest salary as a percentage of GDP. They get not salary, but that's their portion. So just to put it into a very big nutshell for you, if you take all the personal income tax in South Africa as a percentage of GDP, it's just on 10%. It is the 10th highest in the world. Yet our civil servant salaries alone cost us 14% of GDP. So we would have to add another 40% to your tax rate to pay for the civil servants. So you can see that South Africa is already highly taxed. And under those circumstances, now that we're building up to the tax story, that's why you end up having people unhappy about what they have to pay. So on your point of the thing, maybe, and what Lo is saying, maybe it's not just a matter of what we tax, it's also how effectively we spend it. And should civil servants have, say, a 30% premium on the private sector, and most people would say no. In many countries there is a premium, but it's 6 or 7%. So those are the sort of things that we need to think about. Other countries do not have a premium. So we have to think about this a lot more in South Africa, and it is more than road funding. I think the other questions that we had, I think I'd like to say it on the development side from Richard. I don't know who to give that to, but both you, Kuni, and Lo showed photos of a road and development. So you can answer Richard's question on the development side. Sorry for my monologue.
Yes, I think definitely the idea is not to move people. To make economy effective and efficient, we need to create nodes where investors can invest that will attract investment. And I think this is exactly the reason why we do need further investment, to get these roads built in order to allow investors to invest in those communities, in those areas, to get goods and services in and out very effectively and efficiently, and that will ensure that people then do not migrate but actually stay in those areas.
Yeah, I think something that's very important to understand is that we, as somebody that provides road infrastructure, I have no control on who uses the road. If you have a licensed vehicle and you've got a license, you are legal on the road. If everybody decides, I want today to become a freight operator, I go and buy a truck, I insure it, and I've got a driver, I cannot say you're not allowed to be there. So for example, if you look at the railroad issue, because we have no control on how people access the infrastructure as long as you're doing it legally. So when you now look at the question in terms of development, the same applies. We provide the basic road infrastructure, but we cannot force the private sector to go and invest as a road authority into office park development, retail development. That is a decision that's made by private sector based on their models that they use in terms of balance in income and looking at disposable income and the density of people with a certain income level around their development. And I think the fundamental question one needs to ask is for private sector developers that they need to relook the models that they use to decide on where to invest. Because that is what's driving their investment, is they're looking at the catchment area and they're looking at the people in that catchment area in terms of how much do they have to spend. And that's something, as I said, from us as a implementer of infrastructure, we very much have no handle, unless obviously government policy gets formulated going forward. And that's what I was trying to refer to in terms of the densification, in terms of land use management. So if government decides through land use management that these and these areas will not be rezoned, but these and these areas are the ones rezoned where development can occur, that is the way you will then force people that do want to invest into a certain area, but what you'll probably find, they'll do the numbers and say, no, the risk is too big. Sorry, I'm not going to invest here, I'll take my money to Australia.
I'm going to give you the chance on the salaries.
That question about cities is in fact very important. You know, transport, and this is an old saying, there's no need for roads for transport. It's a derived demand. You need to be at activity locations. So the way you structure your cities, the design, the diversity of opportunities, and the density has got a massive impact on movement patterns, probably the most impact. But our cities are notoriously inefficient in South Africa, and I think we should spend a lot more money in reinventing our cities, designing them to become economic hubs where people do not travel long distance. Currently, you've got sleeping towns and employment hubs, and people travel crisscross, no public transport. That causes the problem. So if we can get the cities right, the derived demand, which is transport, will tend to follow that. You know, maybe we need to look at how European cities do it, or South American cities. But it's a good question.
I can't quite remember the question that you asked because I didn't hear everything, I think. Can you repeat it? Do you mind? Sorry.
My question was based on the presentation that Law made regarding the people that buy electric cars, that they are currently not paying anything if they are using electric cars. So my question was like, what are the plans that we can use to make sure that those people pay something at the end of the day, so that they are equal to the people that are buying petrol at the moment?
Okay, Lo, did you get that? And I think at that same time, you may need to answer Professor Walter's question about prosecution.
Yeah, I think maybe, obviously, as I said, if you look at electric car vehicle penetration in South Africa at the moment, and even worldwide, it's incredibly small percentage at the moment. If you look at the countries that has a very active subsidization program, like Norway, for example, Sweden, you'll see a massive growth in electric vehicles. If you now look at South Africa, because it's such a small percentage, our legislative environment or our regulatory environment has not yet been amended. A process is only now being initiated by the Department of Transport to look into policies with regard to electric vehicles. So there's a whole policy adjustment, legislative adjustments that need to occur. Yes, some of those could be to say increase license fees on an electric vehicle. So where another guy might be paying 800 Rand, you may turn around to say, no, he must now pay 3,000 Rand a year, for example, if you comparatively compare it with the amount of fuel you would have bought during the year. So those are things that are being done in the United States. I think the question, however, that one needs to ask yourself, if you take a further step back, South Africa, and okay, we now got the broad part of fine, but we don't have our own crude oil. Our biggest, and I mean Mike can confirm the numbers, our biggest forex expenditure per month is crude oil importation. So now you must ask yourself the question, is it maybe not better for South Africa to promote electric vehicles so that we can import less crude oil and then we can maybe buy some electricity from Eskom in the bigger picture, because the money stays, okay, most of it, the money stays in the country because we generate the electricity locally, we then charge the cars, you drive. The money stays. With crude oil, a large chunk of the money leaves the country. And with all these decisions, when you talk about roads and all of these things you talk about, you always need to look at the bigger picture. I mean, if you think of in South Africa, it might be very beneficial for South Africa to make a decision to say, we will actively invest in electrifying all the minibus taxis. Because then I can get the minibus taxis off fuel, diesel fuel, for example. Then suddenly I can up the diesel price to make the road-rail discussion more comparative. At the moment, you cannot up the diesel price because the bulk of the new taxis in this country are diesel. And you always need to understand how these things are interlinking to one another and why you can't just pull a string here and then it impacts there. But if we make these kind of collective decisions, you'll probably find it will be far more beneficial for South Africa if we can push to have electric vehicle penetration as quick, as fast as possible, especially for our public transport, that you can move them off and then you can start addressing the other differences between road and rail, for example. In terms of prosecutions, maybe just to allude, the original GFIP or the e-toll scheme had various instruments for it to be effective. Part of those instruments was obviously based on people not paying. So there's a number of blocking the renewal of your licenses, for example. All these mechanisms exist. SARS taking the money out of your bank account, for example. They are all mechanisms that are designed to have been incorporated as part of the solution. The problem, however, is that the rollout of a number of those instruments are not in the hands of someone. You're either reliant on another entity, even if it's an entity within the same Department of Transport. You will see now the ARTO Amendment Bill is only 2 days ago approved by the Portfolio Committee of Transport. We are reliant on all of those things to get into place that will now allow the license blocks to occur if you haven't paid your tolls, for example. In terms of prosecuting the people, we've got a whole list lined up. once again there we are dependent on other entities in terms of the process. So if your cases just do not get on the case roll at court because there are so many other more important cases, then you do end up with the message being sent that there is no consequence. What is happening? I mean, if a lot of people, if you go to a braai, and people talk about e-tolls, then the people, are you paying? Are you mad? I mean, I haven't paid from day one, and look, nothing has happened to me. And then in the end, you get crucified for having paid because you're in the minority. No. So I always tell them, I work for Sunroll, I have to pay. No. But obviously, but if they know, for example, and that's what I'm saying, so people are saying, but I've not been paying and there's been no consequence. And as I say, yes, it's all been part of the plan that those things to be done, but it's where you are reliant on a lot of other processes that do not fall into place. Hopefully you will see in the coming months those processes falling into place, where you will start seeing this action being taken and all of that. And hopefully that will clear the process going forward in terms of exactly where one stands with regard to the legality of the e-toll system and all of that. So there's a number of those court cases, test cases that needs to happen with OTA to answer a number of these constitutionality, the legality, and all of those things of the e-tolls that will hopefully clarify the process going forward in terms of where we stand.
Yeah, I think just to add on to what I was saying is that there are a number of instruments that can be applied and used to ensure enforcement. And I do think that this is quite important for government to be clear on policy. A lot of that doesn't sit with Sunroll, it sits actually with government having to make very clear policy decisions on how it will enforce. Secondly, in terms of some of the cases that we have, there's roughly about 25,000 cases at court right now. So we are actioning this, we are taking people to court, and people will be held accountable. That's quite a negative way of doing it, but we do need to make sure that people are being held accountable. I think the other point that the gentleman made on the electric vehicles is that, and this is why tolling is a far better option in my view than a fuel levy, because a fuel levy is an indiscriminate levy. It's an indiscriminate tax, and you actually tax per. We've seen the statistics. You actually tax poor people even more. Rich people can buy themselves out of this tax. They can buy an electric vehicle, for example. So, and that is why we believe that a fuel levy is not the final solution. We do need to look at alternative funding methods, of which one would be a kind of a user-paid principle that has been accepted by government.
Now the next set of questions is very open. You can ask whatever question you want. I'll just say on the fuel or on the electric vehicles, I think the last number I have of new car sales worldwide, they're just over 2%, I think 2.3%, around there, but they're far less of the car park, so they're probably not even 0.5% of the world's cars at the moment on the road. So yes, fuel or electric vehicles will come in and probably a lot quicker than many think, but I don't think it's going to be quite as quick as your optimistic futurists are pointing out. I think there's some guys that says 90% of vehicles will be electric by 2023. I don't think that'll happen. All right, next set of questions. All right, Andrew over there, I'll go to you.
Thanks, Mike. My name's Andrew Barker. I'm a town planner and development consultant, and I may be the lone chicken in the wolf pen here. I don't know if there are any other planners, but there are help. I think at the beginning, somebody asked the question around the chicken or egg. What comes first? Is it the road or the development? And I think the examples were given, the road comes, the development comes. But I think we've actually got to look at a miraculous conception here, because we actually need to do integrated development planning. We're not. We're sitting in silos as road planners and as town planners. The town planning policies are there for densification, for creating nodes of development and economic growth. But the roads guys go and put their networks down based on, in Gauteng, a 1970 network, which wasn't designed to move people between economic nodes. We all know that. We've got to rethink our basic networks of roads. And yes, as planners, we need to rethink how we plan the cities. And then we have to implement it. So let's accept that there are urban development boundaries which are trying to create a densification of urban areas to bring people closer to where they are living as workplaces and implement it. Yes, the investors do tend to follow market trends, but what are we doing to incentivize the investors to develop in development corridors? How much are we spending on road infrastructure and road planning as opposed to investing in incentivizing developers to develop in the nodes and the corridors? And I think it's that integrated approach which is critical. And unfortunately, in South Africa, we live in silos. And it's time for the miraculous birth of an integrated planning and development process. Thanks.
Okay, is that a comment then, not a question?
Comment, but I'd like to hear opinion.
Okay, Andrew says he'd like to hear opinions. Are there any other questions in front there? And then I'll come to you, sir.
I think Central can acquire their money from the annual vehicle licensing disc renewal, because last year we were paying extra 42 rand, and this year we are paying 72 rand added on the vehicle licensing renewal. So I think that's a good idea if we can do that.
There's one guy in the back, then I'll come to you, sir.
Thank you. My name is Terry Markman. Somebody right at the beginning of the session asked the question, how much roads, much in inverted commas, what volume of roads does a society or should a society construct? I guess that's really the starting point in the $60,000 question. It seems to me essentially that there is no answer in the current makeup of the economy and the way things are run, simply because roads are not constructed via the price mechanism. The price mechanism, as economists will tell you, works very, very well where there's a freedom of entry and consumers can buy and sell anything. They can buy anything and producers can sell anything. So it works with clothes, it works with food. When it comes to things like roads, there is no price mechanism. Maybe toll roads come sort of close to it, but that's only for a very small section of the road network. There's no price mechanism, there's no competition, and therefore I'm afraid to say that there will never, ever, ever be an answer of how much roads to build. It will always be a political football where various vested interests will argue that their interests are better than others. They'll get economists to prove this, that, or the other. And although, as transport economists, we would say that investments in roads is good, we will never, ever, ever be able to prove that without a price mechanism, and it doesn't exist. In places like Singapore and London, they've got congestion pricing, but that's not really to decide how much roads to build. It's to try and get people to stop using their roads. I mean, Singapore's fantastic. You can drive around there in peak hours. There's no traffic because it costs you as much to get a license in Singapore as it does to cost a road. And just a final comment. In the 19th century, not many people are aware that the first underground ever built in London was built by the private sector. And who built it? The developer, somewhere in the north of London, decided that he needed to get access to the centre of London, so he put in an underground. And in a similar way, all the the entire New York underground system was started by private sector. It was built by private sector, but that's another story. Thanks.
Okay, interesting. I'm coming to this gentleman in front here, and thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Muhim. I'm representing a company called SGS. My question will be specifically focused to Sandro. Your presentation was quite detailed and I admired it personally. Just with regards to the curve, before 1995, you said government obviously provided more funding to the road infrastructure of South Africa. After 1995, it went down. Have you guys ever thought of, well, the reason why it went down, you've given us reasons as the government will shut down schools or some sort of, or they'll close down hospitals and so forth. But has Central ever thought of going into government and proposing, with working with different educational departments, by upskilling the workforce of South Africa? Because if I had a look at the stats at your presentation that you provided, you said it's approximately 4 million rand to maintain a road, 4 million rand to maintain a kilometer. How do you guys also award your tenders, or how do you evaluate your suppliers? You know, at the same time, also adding value to the Department of Education and also to the road infrastructure. Have you guys ever thought of any strategy of that sort? Thank you.
Looks like a lot of the questions are coming to Sandra the whole time. I think let's start with the roads, but I think the development questions I'm going to leave to the Professor Stephen here, if that's okay with you. And then you can start. Sorry, though.
Yeah, I think I'll just quickly touch on the whole issue of integrated planning, and I think what you'll see is government has realized the problem that people don't talk to one another, and there's a new act called Spatial Land Use Management Act that is forcing all 3 spheres of government to plan together. Right? So everybody, all 3 needs to get into the same room. I'm not saying that they will agree on anything necessarily, but there is concerted effort in terms of land use management planning going forward, because it all revolves around spatial planning in terms of land use that will dictate what is required from electricity, water, from a road transport side. So it's identified, there's an act put in place in terms of how and what needs to be done. We're just battling to get the regulations sorted out with the relevant department, because once again, people read things differently. I think the big issue we have, if you say, referring to the GFIP network or the old PWV route network in the Gauteng that was planned, a very important thing to understand is that if you have not secured a corridor for a road well in advance, it's virtually impossible to go and retrofit it. So these corridors that were secured in the 1970s, the PWV corridor network, you are virtually stuck to those corridors for new road development because of all the other development that has happened in the open areas around it. For me to come around and say, I want to retrofit a road through this golf course, I can just tell you through the current environmental processes and things like that, it will be impossible. So what is happening is that the problem we confronted with as soon as you want to build a road, everybody wants a road close by, conveniently, as long as it's not next to you. And that is a challenge that we are continuously facing in terms of road development that are restricting us to corridors that are there, that have been proclaimed many years ago. I think in terms of the vehicle license fees, please note that income is reserved for the provinces. So Sunwell gets nothing that is collected. It's one of the few taxes that goes to the province. The vehicle license charges goes to as a provincial income stream. It does not come to Sunwell at all. It doesn't go to Treasury. It goes directly to the provincial income stream for that province. So it's one of the few taxes that provinces can pay.
And it's only about 6.
It's about 7.8 billion at the moment, totally countrywide. It generates about 7.8 billion per annum. It will generate. So what you'll see these days are lots of truck with Mpumalanga number plates, because Mpumalanga's price is slightly lower than Gauteng and North. So then private sector goes and registers their whole fleet of trucks in Mpumalanga.
Next year, another province will drop their price slightly or not increases, then the whole fleet of trucks moves to the other province. And that's unfortunately how it operates in terms of that. I think the question in terms of how much roads do we need, I think what's important to understand, of that network that you see there of 750,000 kilometers, as I indicated, about 170,000 kilometers is surface or paved. The bulk of those are gravel roads that are carrying 20, 30, 40 vehicles a day. Needless to say, those economically you cannot surface. But we do have gravel roads, and if you look at the threshold economically for surfacing of gravel roads is in the order of about 300 to 350 vehicles per day, where it becomes, from a life cycle point of view, cheaper to surface a gravel road and maintain it than continuously blade and re-gravel it, because it's also got a major environmental negativity in terms of gravel and dust. Out of that network, we sit with about 10,000 kilometers of gravel roads currently in this country, carrying more than 350 vehicles a day. So that is potentially, economically, what you can justify to be surfaced. Unfortunately, as you've indicated, politically, there are sometimes decisions made, not just now, it's been historically. I can on a map show you roads that are surfaced and then it stops in the middle of nowhere, and then I can show you which minister owned that farm. It happened all along. Unfortunately, these kind of political decisions that are made in terms of surfacing certain roads and things. But as I said, not all 750,000 needs to be surfaced. We're looking at about another 10,000 that's economically justifiable in terms of the gravel network to be surfaced. In terms of the money, where the money has gone, what's happened to the money, I think what one needs to realize in the new South Africa after 1994, the money is shared between a lot more people. Previously, the money that was there, the money in which it was shared, was to benefit a smaller part of society. The money now is shared to benefit all in society. And you'll see a lot of the money will have gone into basic services. It would have gone into water, electricity. If we go to rural communities today, and I'm working on a road, I can't tell you how many of our projects are stopped by violent protests, where the community tells us, we don't want a road, we have no water. I cannot drink the road. No. And we are stopped and they tell us, until such time that we have water, we don't want the road. So if you look at the basic priorities of humankind, you will see your most basic priority is food, water, food. Thereafter, in terms of electricity, they will say, no, but electricity will be nice because it improves my life. I can have a fridge, I can have a TV, for example. And then only they'll tell you, okay, now the road will be nice. In terms of it. And I think those are the challenges, what we find. And once again, it comes back to the previous comment in terms of integrated planning. At a government level, there are no integrated planning between water, electricity, education, health, roads. You get the Department of Education building a school across a very busy freeway because there's cheap land. Then the kids needs to cross the freeway. There's no bridge being built by them. They say it's not their problem. They just go and drop the school on the other side. If we've done some better planning, we could have seen it's a lot cheaper to pay 1 million rand for a stand on this side than to try and build a 35 million rand pedestrian bridge. But that integrated planning is not happening. And the reason why it's not happening, because everyone is king of his castle. Everyone gets his slice of money and nobody else will tell him how to spend it in terms of that. And that's why, as I said, these things in terms of integrated planning, government is aware of it, but it goes a lot broader than just what we talk about here. It's water, electricity, all. If we are able to hit a community where the community sees, here's the water plan, here's the electricity plan, here's the roads plan, it will make a big difference.
I just want to give Professor Stephen here some time on the pricing of roads and stuff.
Again, to that gentleman on the city, yeah, you know, I think it's the problem lies with our cities. You know? As I said, transport remains derived. You first plan the activities and then the transport, and not necessarily the roads. We need to look at public transport, and we all know the very efficient rail system we've got operating in our cities. But we need to also understand that if you have a city and you build highways accessing the city, what it allows people, if you don't price that highway, it allows people and the city to move further away, and the city starts sprawling. That puts pressure on you know, water, reticulation, electricity, etc., your infrastructure. If you price that road correctly, then of course you reduce that friction and people will move closer to it. But again, that is not a toll. Now, I'm not talking about, I talk about an appropriate price for the road. So in a sense, I am supporting them. So it is important that we price roads right to reflect that cost to society. And if we can get that right, you know, we'll get there. But our cities remain our principal drivers of growth, and we need to understand it. The gentleman said there that we will never get the pricing right. I think we can. You know, it is quite easy. Give me an hour and I'll give you the exact road price. The problem is in implementing that price, number one, because it varies by the hour, by the minute, by the type of vehicle. Getting it to the user, getting him to pay. You know, these guys can vouch for me. But another problem with...
We must tell them about the future because of those cars. You told us last time that all the measurements.
And in fact, we will tell you the exact price that you should pay for the roads in the next one. But what happens if that income is not enough? If the user pay principle delivers to little income? If you drive on a highway in the middle of the night through the crew, what is your cost? You know, you've got no congestion cost, very little maintenance cost, pretty much nothing. Accident cost is pretty much nothing. Then your income, and governments often use road pricing as a means to generate income. So they are not too keen to determine the exact price and to market it. It is a tax source.
Yeah, on that note, I think as a tax source, just on an overall picture, we are probably the one country in the last 30 years that has increased the tax to GDP ratio quite a bit. And when one thinks of apartheid, one thought, well, we would have to share a lot more of the resources of the country, but we were supposed to have savings too. Instead of 2 bridges over a railway line, we were supposed to have only 1. And, you know, we've increased the tax rates and everything like that. And I sometimes think we just don't get bang for buck. And I think that's where a lot of the crucial things lie. And the other thing is I just wanted to remind the Professor Stephen here, when you told us about each car since 1995 or something, has some sort of registration in it that the manufacturers know about. They can actually trace you already. And so we're not far away from where they know where you are, where your car is, how long it's been, where. And in that sense, I think we'll be moving much closer to pricing, let's call it personal transport for a broader picture, not just cars, and public transport. And it will be an interesting thing to see how the world goes there. I think, well, the 2 examples you named, and congestion charges in London, are just the start.
Is only just beginning to look at the legislation that will be needed for electric vehicles. And that's something that worries me a great deal. Uber began operations in South Africa in 2013, and a National Land Transport Amendment Bill was introduced in the same year. We're now in 2019, and Uber is very well established, but there's still no legal definition. And it's a worry that in the in the dramatically changing world of the 3rd and 4th, and maybe, as Peter Bruce said the other day, the 5th industrial revolution, our legislation may just be following on behind.
Thank you. I got a secret question here. I can have it read by, I think, Kunning. I'm going to put you on the spot so that you can see that it's not me. You can see my writing. and read the question, and then if you can answer it, if you can't, then
I'll pass it
on.
Okay. It says the Gauteng provincial departments and local councils vehicles, are they paying e-tolls, 100% collections? If not, is there any compliance action taken against them? What I can say is definitely we do deal with the departments of government in a form that we call key accounts. So they have an amplified account. We do monitor these accounts and we do monitor compliance. There are some accounts that are not fully up to speed, but that is a continuous process to ensure that people do comply. I think what we also need to remember is that some of the government vehicles are exempt. So all emergency vehicles, all military vehicles, and all police vehicles are all exempt from paying e-tolls.
On the development side of things and the integration of local, provincial, and so on, I think I'm going to allow the professor to quickly give us a bit of a background.
That was a very good question. What you touch on is what we need. We've got so many needs in our country, and Lowe said it. People can't eat a road; they want water. Once you've got water, you want electricity, and then you want education for your schools, and then you want a hospital, and then you want a road. And the farmers maybe want a road to get their fruits to international markets. So we have to get our priorities right. The pot of money is only so big, and we need to make hard decisions. And their government needs to step in and say, I represent you. These are our needs. This is our tax money, and it's not unlimited. And we can tax ourselves into poverty. It's quite easy to do that. We need to grow the economy. Then the multiplier kicks in. And we need to say, well, these are our needs. This is our policy. This is how we're going to implement it. That's the way forward. Now let's get going. That's what we do, as simple as that. I thought the National Development Plan was quite good. It lacked an implementing agent. I thought NatMap was quite good. I think it lacked an implementing agent. So we're good on the policies, taking it a step further and making that trade-offs. I think that's where we are not very good. And often that is a political decision which is maybe not right. The gentleman there said the mobility for the future. We had a very interesting initiative in South Africa called the Mobility Center for Africa that got workshops going. I thought it was very good. And I'm not sure what happened. I think it was a private sector initiative, and they had workshops once every 2 months where they involved everyone. What are the new trends? Driverless cars. What the hell are we going to do? We probably already have driverless cars in South Africa. But and I'm not entirely sure if the centre is still active. I thought it was, as I said, a very good idea, and maybe that is again something the DOT should start.
Lowe, one last time to you. Then
I think just quickly in terms of the questions, if I look at down in Durban, the N3, N2, you'll see on that list that I showed you, there are major projects that were identified to be implemented there. Obviously, the intention was to utilize the same e-toll mechanism to fund those investments. I think in totality, the investment required at the moment there, I think on the N3, we're looking at 34 billion. And the investment we're looking on the N2 from the old airport to the new port is in the order, the latest estimates is about 18 or 19 billion that's required. Once again, the money is not available from Treasury. We are starting using the non-toll money because there is critical bottlenecks on the N3 between Pietermaritzburg that's impacting the freight. The problem is just because we don't have access to huge amounts of money, you need to do it piecemeal. So instead of what we've done here in the GFIP, where you do everything in a 3-year period, the whole network, you work everywhere, you will now take probably 15 to 20 years to roll a similar approach out with the funding you have available. So with the stimulus package, we got additional money, and that additional money we got from the stimulus is now invested into 2 parts of the N3, for example, to start addressing those severe capacity constraints that are occurring there on the N3. So I think that part, I think maybe just in terms of funding, remember, it's in the ambit of National Treasury. National Treasury has got various commissions that advise them on where money must go and why, and that does do a lot of research for them and giving them advice and everything like that. So it's not from our side. I think in terms of the smart technology, the smart roads, there are various initiatives on the go in South Africa in terms of this whole autonomous vehicles that are coming, the integration between infrastructure and technology. I think once again the problem we have with that, same with electric vehicles, in terms is how long the process takes to amend the legislation, if there's legislative amendments required, the standards and all of that. And unfortunately, once again, from a Sunwell side, we're only a contributor around the table. We are not responsible for formulating policy. And that's where your challenge lies, is the speed at which policy can be updated and gone through the legislative process.
Peter, have you got anything you want to say at the moment? Just quickly. And we're going to end off because we're standing between a dishwasher or a dish.
Problem with
sunlight.
Problem with Eskom is that people don't want to pay. And I feel sorry for Eskom. Let's not have the same problem with Sunwell.
Kuni, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I think what we you need to understand is that South Africa's got huge challenges. I mean, we've got really immense problems, which we will not all solve in one day. But I do think what we need to start is, it starts with attitude and behavior. And a lot of what we spoke about this afternoon was also about attitude and behavior. It's about politicians taking responsibility for their citizens, their constituents, and taking that accountability to make sure that they rule properly and accountable. But it's also for us as citizens to make sure that we hold politicians accountable, and that we then insist on proper governance. And at the same time, also think it is time for us to look at ourselves and see what can we do. Every little bit helps, and I think we need to start with some small steps, and pretty soon we'll see that we'll be on track.
Lo, do you want to say anything more? No, you. Okay, I'm going to end this discussion. I'm just going to give you one figure, a broad figure, actually two little figures, but they're the same thing. The first is in South Africa at the moment for the last 5, 6, 7 years, our capital formation, or what you would call in layman's terms fixed investment to GDP, has been 18%, which is one of the poorer countries in the world, sort of with fixed investment, or lower countries. Of the fixed investment, of our GDP, government only produces 3.2% of fixed investment. And if you compare that even to rich countries who already have a lot of the roads and the dams and the infrastructure, they average about 3.5. So we even average less than the developed countries, which are richer, don't need as much investment. And that maybe says to you where a lot of the problems come from, because ironically, I think government should be putting 5 to 7% of GDP into fixed investment. And I think that's also where we've got to start thinking very, very differently, because if we don't have the economic infrastructure, the water, the electricity, the roads, the dams, the sewage, the hospitals, it's going to be very difficult to have a modern economy. With that, I'll hand you back to Harry, who's going to draw a number or a card, business card, and may it be more than sunlight liquid.
Thank you very much, Mike. Ladies and gents, let's give our panel a hand. Got a great panel this afternoon, great discussions, and a great audience. Thank you very much for staying. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Ladies and gents, here's the box for the lucky draw. We're going to send it around. Should your business card not be in here yet, kindly make sure it's not in there. If you haven't got a business card, then take this one and remove the paper from the plastic like this. You put in the paper into the box. And only one business card per person.
We discovered previously that one guy had 8 cards. So can you quickly just send it around, and let's start here. Just send it around, please. Ladies and gents, please make sure that you complete the feedback forms in your tables. We really need your feedback to improve on our sessions. We have quite a number of people who followed us online. Just for interesting sake, I think Paul is now offline. Paul, we're still online. Okay, so we had quite a number of people online following us, and you can see we were jumping. He's got a complete control panel there, so he's like a TV production, switching between cameras. Sometimes he's using the audio in my hand, just for interesting sake. Sometimes I could see on the screen, sometimes he's using the audio, sometimes he's using audio and video, and then he switches over to that camera. So it's quite interesting to see how this production happens. You can go on the Transport Forum's YouTube channel. You go to YouTube, you just search for Transport Forum. You'll obviously see a few Transport Forums, but one of them you'll recognize our logo. Subscribe to that channel, and then you can see this videos taken at these events. You can also have a look at last week's videos taken there. So it's all online, you can follow them, and obviously you can see the presentations, the downloaded presentations. So all the content is there, and it's all for free. So I really request you or ask you to subscribe to our channel. So Jody, thank you Jody, helping us there. Jody's the lady from Brand Source. Thank you Jody. I've asked our host, Kuni, to do the draw this afternoon.